On November 7, 2019, Marta Calvo-Barone failed to show up for a scheduled meeting with her mother. Her phone was unreachable and messages went unanswered. The last known trace of her was a live location she had shared from Manuel, a small town south of Valencia. At first, her disappearance seemed like a misunderstanding. Perhaps her phone had lost signal. Maybe she had decided to stay at a friend's house or simply needed some time alone. But by the next morning, her mother's concern had turned into fear. What happened to Marta that night? Marta Calvo-Barone, 25 years old, was the eldest of 3 siblings. She worked in the hospitality industry, but her real passion was in beauty, aesthetics. Together with her mother, Marisol Barone, she was planning to open a nail and beauty studio. They had already found a location, and the lease was ready to sign. It was a dream they shared, a symbol of their hard work, hope for the future. Marta and her mother had an exceptionally close and trusting relationship. They spoke every day, exchanging calls, messages throughout the day. Marisol, a single mother raising 3 children while working as a warehouse supervisor at a supermarket, devoted her life to her family, especially Marta. She was protective but never controlling. Their bond was built on love and mutual respect. Nearby, Jorge Ignacio Palma, originally from Colombia, was living in Spain illegally. His criminal history was extensive, ranging from small-scale banned substances trafficking to involvement in large cocaine shipments, and his name was already familiar to law enforcement across several countries. Despite multiple arrests in Spain and Italy, he somehow managed to avoid deportation and continued his illicit activities. On the surface, though, he appeared calm, confident, and respectable, traits that allowed him to blend in, deflect suspicion. At first glance, Marta and Jorge seemed to exist in 2 completely different worlds. Marta was open, optimistic, and full of plans for her future, while Palma operated in the shadows, hidden from the authorities, connected to criminal networks, and accustomed to deceit. Marisol never imagined the danger lurking behind her daughter's new acquaintance. What began as a casual encounter would soon spiral into one of the most shocking crimes Spain had seen in years. Valencia, Spain's 3rd largest city, lies along the country's eastern coast, a vibrant hub of tourism, business, and culture. Beneath its bright Mediterranean charm, however, runs a darker current. Thanks to its port access and strategic highways, Valencia has long served as a major entry point for smuggling operations, including shipments of banned substances from Latin America. Beyond the city's lively plazas and sunny boulevards is a hidden underworld, a network of temporary apartments and illegal rentals, where undocumented individuals can live under the radar. It was within this shadowy space that Palma, despite his illegal status, moved freely, renting homes under false identities, forming connections, and staying one step ahead of law enforcement. About 60 kilometers southwest of Valencia lies Manuel, a quiet rural town of just over 2,500 residents. With limited infrastructure, minimal police presence, and a sense of isolation, it was the kind of place where someone could vanish or make someone else vanish without attracting much attention. Palma specifically chose a rented house there for its remoteness, knowing it would give him privacy and time. November 7, 2019, began like any ordinary day for Marta. That morning, she texted her mother to cancel their planned meeting, saying she had another engagement. She told her mother that she was going out of town, but didn't mention any names. Marisol didn't question it. She trusted her daughter completely. At 25, Marta was independent, smart, and responsible. Although her mother felt a pang of disappointment at the last-minute change, she didn't press for details. She simply wished her daughter a good evening. Visiting Manuel wasn't unusual for Marta. She occasionally met people through dating apps and had previously met Palma that way. When he reached out again, Marta agreed to meet him, feeling comfortable and in control. On the day she disappeared, Marta boarded a train from Valencia to Manuel. From there, she took a taxi to her final destination. Ever cautious, Marta sent her mother a message containing her live location. It was something she often did, just a simple way to reassure her mother that everything was fine. That single gesture would turn out to be vital to the investigation, pinpointing her last known whereabouts, a rental property quietly secured by Palma, who had gone out of his way to avoid drawing attention. The morning of November 8, 2019, began quietly for Marisol. There was no message from her daughter, something that usually arrived like clockwork. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe Marta had been tired after the night out. Maybe she got home late and decided to sleep in. Still, as the hours passed and no reply came, Marisol sent another message. Again, no response. By afternoon, Marta's phone was unreachable and her WhatsApp messages remained unread. That's when worry began to turn into fear. Marta was always careful. If there was a delay, especially while visiting somewhere unfamiliar, she would have said something. The day dragged on in anxious silence. Marisol tried to stay hopeful. Perhaps Marta's phone had died, or maybe she had just lost track of time. But as night fell and the silence deepened, denial was no longer possible. This wasn't a simple delay. Something was terribly wrong. After 24 hours with no word from her daughter, Marisol knew she couldn't wait any longer. She decided to follow the only lead she had, the geolocation Marta had sent before disappearing. It led to a specific address in the quiet town of Manuel. Determined, she went there herself. When she arrived, she knocked on the door. A man answered. He looked composed, even polite, but his eyes flickered uneasily, never meeting hers for long. That man was Palma. Marisol asked him directly if he had seen her daughter, explaining that Marta had shared this address before going missing. Palma denied everything. He claimed he didn't know anyone by that name, said no one had visited him, and insisted he'd been alone all night. His manner was polite, but there was something cold and evasive about him. He seemed anxious to end the conversation. Marisol pressed further, hoping there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps he had seen someone who matched Marta's description. But Palma just repeated his denial. Deep down, Marisol felt this man knew something. She didn't have proof. She didn't have authority. But she had a mother's intuition, and every instinct screamed that this stranger was lying. That same day, she reached out to Marta's closest friends. She showed them the address from the message Marta had sent. One friend recalled Marta mentioning a man she had met online, a man who lived outside the city, but she hadn't shared his name. With no new information and no one else to turn to, Marisol went straight to the Valencia police station hoping to find help. Marisol reported Marta missing after not being able to reach her for over a day. However, the police require a 48-hour waiting period before investigating a missing person case. The officer explained that Marta was an adult and had the right to disappear. Unless there was evidence suggesting she was in danger, they couldn't investigate it as a crime. Marisol tried to explain. This wasn't like her daughter. Marta always called, always answered her messages. She never vanished without a word, not for hours, let alone a full day. This wasn't independence, this was a warning sign. But the officer dismissed her concern. To him, there was no crime, and without that, there would be no investigation, not even a visit to the address her daughter had sent. Marisol refused to give up. She pushed back, demanding that her report at least be formally filed. The officer reluctantly agreed, but the document he produced was bare bones, missing crucial details such as her visit to Palma's house, his suspicious behavior, and the geolocation Marta had voluntarily shared before vanishing. No visit to the property, no phone calls, no follow-up, nothing. The police simply logged the case as a routine report and told her to wait. Marisol left the station in disbelief, not just because her daughter was missing, but because of the indifference she had just encountered. The system that was supposed to protect her had turned its back when it mattered most. Realizing that waiting could only make things worse, Marisol decided to act on her own. While continuing to pressure the authorities, she filed multiple reports with different departments, called daily for updates, and insisted the case be treated as urgent. But the response never changed. Bureaucracy held firm. Without concrete evidence that Marta's disappearance involved violence or foul play, her case remained a low priority. Days slipped by. Marta's phone stayed off. Her messages remained unread. And while the police hesitated, Palma had exactly what he needed. Time. Time to erase traces. Time to plan his next move. Eventually, under mounting public pressure and thanks to Marisol's persistence, the case was transferred to Spain's Guardia Civil, the national law enforcement agency. The new team immediately changed course. They began a full investigation, starting with the location Marta had sent before disappearing and retracing her final steps. Agents went to the property in Manuel, the same address tied to Palma. Even from the outside, the house gave off an eerie sense of concealment. The shutters were closed tight, curtains drawn, no sign of life within. When officers knocked and asked to enter, Palma refused, citing his legal rights. The standoff caused delays, but with a formal complaint on record and probable cause established, investigators obtained a search warrant. What they found inside was deeply unsettling. The kitchen and bathroom reeked of disinfectant. Every surface had been scrubbed. Tiles gleamed unnaturally clean. In one room, they discovered women's clothing, items that could have belonged to Marta. Outside, the trash bin contained paper towels marked with suspicious stains. Investigators collected everything: fabric fragments, hair strands, and biological residue. On one wall, faint reddish smears, possibly blood, became visible under specialized lighting. Every trace was carefully photographed and sealed for forensic testing. At the same time, the Guardia Civil cyber and telecom units began tracing Marta's digital trail. Cell tower data confirmed what Marisol had feared. Marta's phone lost signal just meters from Palma's residence, the exact spot she had pinned for her mother on the evening of November 7, 2019. Then, nothing. The pattern was undeniable. Marta had reached Palma's house and she had never left. With mounting evidence, the authorities officially reclassified the case. Marta Calvo Barón was no longer just missing, she was presumed the victim of a violent crime. Palma's behavior only deepened suspicion. His statements were contradictory, his timeline incoherent, and his alibi full of holes. He appeared tense, evasive, and manipulative. The investigation escalated swiftly. Forensic teams, crime scene specialists, DNA experts were deployed. What had begun as a missing person inquiry had now turned into a major homicide investigation, centered on Palma and the chilling possibility that Marta's final moments had taken place within those freshly scrubbed walls. As suspicion tightened around him, Palma disappeared. His house in Manuel Valencia remained an active crime scene, but he was nowhere to be found. Investigators learned that shortly after his initial questioning, Palma had quietly left the property. He stopped answering calls, cut off communication with acquaintances, and avoided all familiar places. For almost a month, there was no trace of him. None of the addresses he had previously used showed any sign of life. Friends, neighbors, and former contacts hadn't seen or heard from him. Authorities were convinced he was deliberately hiding, doing everything possible to avoid being captured as the investigation closed in. Then, on December 4, 2019, something completely unexpected happened. Jorge Ignacio Palma walked voluntarily into a Guardia Civil station. After weeks in hiding, his sudden reappearance baffled investigators, and what he said next stunned them even more. He claimed he wanted to confess. During questioning, Palma offered his own version of events. According to him, Marta Calvo had died of an accidental overdose while the two were together at his home. He stated they had both consumed illegal substances voluntarily, and that her death was sudden, without any signs of violence. He said, overcome with panic, he didn't know how to react and decided to dispose of her body. Palma told investigators he had dismembered Marta's body in the bathroom, using whatever tools he could find before disposing of the remains in trash containers scattered across different towns in Valencia. He insisted he acted out of fear and shock, claiming he never meant to harm her, admitting only to concealing the body, not causing her death. From the very beginning, investigators doubted his story. His explanation lacked credibility. His behavior after the incident, destroying evidence, fleeing, and refusing to cooperate, didn't match that of a man overcome by panic after a tragic accident. On the contrary, the calculated manner in which he hid the body suggested preparation, consistency, and method, clear signs of intent rather than impulse. Forensic experts also questioned the plausibility of an overdose without visible symptoms. Moreover, without a body to examine, a full autopsy was impossible, creating the greatest obstacle to uncovering the truth, leaving Palma's version entirely unverified. Digging deeper into Palma's background, investigators uncovered his long criminal record, his history of banned substances trafficking, and prior suspicions of violent behavior, all of which further eroded his credibility. His so-called confession didn't close the case. Instead, it triggered a much broader and more intense investigation into his involvement in Marta Calvo Barón's death. When Palma's photograph was made public, it unleashed a wave of new testimonies. Women who had never linked themselves to Marta's case began contacting the police. One of the first was a woman named Arlene. After seeing Palma's face on television, she decided to speak out. She described a terrifying encounter after meeting him through an escort website. Palma had brought cocaine, pressured her into taking it at his home, then attacked her, despite her resistance and even her unconsciousness. He showed no concern for her condition and later dropped her off as if nothing had happened. After the first woman came forward, others followed. Several more victims reported similar experiences to the Guardia Civil. Though the details varied, the similarities were striking. Palma followed a disturbing pattern, targeting women, arranging meetings at his residence, pressuring them to use banned substances, and then acting with violence. In nearly every encounter, the women's safety and lives were placed in serious danger. These statements were crucial in broadening the accusations against Palma. They indicated that he intentionally chose his victims and repeatedly used the same methods. The investigation into Marta's disappearance uncovered two previously unrelated deaths, both now suspected to be linked to Palma. Arlene Ramos, 32, a Brazilian woman, died in a hospital after a man dropped her off and quickly left. While her death was initially thought to be a cocaine overdose, her medical record showed injuries that didn't match an accidental overdose. Security footage and vehicle records later confirmed that Palma was the man who left her at the hospital. Marcela Vargas, 26, a Colombian national, was found dead in a rented apartment. An autopsy revealed banned substances in her system and evidence of physical violence. Phone records later showed Palma was the last person she contacted before her death. Both women had worked as escorts. These two deaths happened before Marta disappeared, but at the time, police didn't realize there was a connection. It was only after Marta's case received widespread media coverage that the similarities became apparent. What initially seemed like unrelated incidents were now recognized as a disturbing pattern. For many years, Palma has followed a certain pattern. He targeted women, especially those advertising escort services online. In each instance, Palma allegedly gave the women cocaine in capsules. These capsules were meant to be inserted internally, which caused a fast and extremely strong reaction. This often resulted in the women becoming unconscious or losing control. Medical reports, including those from Arlene Ramos's case, showed that the women had dangerously high and potentially fatal levels of cocaine in their bodies, even for people who regularly used the banned substances. This indicated a deliberate and methodical approach. Authorities believe Palma followed a calculated system, not acting on impulse. He appeared to have developed a low-risk strategy for overpowering his victims, repeating the same behaviors without adapting to individual situations. confident in its effectiveness. The trial of Jorge Ignacio Palma, started in 2022, immediately became a major national news story. The courtroom was packed with media, including live broadcasters and many reporters. Public interest groups were also closely watching the proceedings, creating a tense atmosphere. However, the most impactful parts of the trial were the testimonies of the survivors and Marta's mother, Marisol. Survivors, many of whom had never shared their experiences publicly, gave detailed accounts. These accounts highlighted Palma's detached and unemotional behavior and his lack of compassion. Although the events happened at different times and places, the survivors' stories were remarkably similar. Marisol delivered a powerful testimony. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, her voice steady, her grief unmistakable. She didn't ask for revenge but demanded truth and justice. Prosecutors referred to her statement as a central piece of the case, giving emotional weight to the hard evidence. Palma's defense was contradictory. He admitted to meeting Marta and using substances with her, but insisted her death was the result of an accidental overdose. Regarding the other cases, he claimed all encounters were consensual and the outcomes tragic but unintended. His legal team tried to portray him as cooperative, but the evidence painted a different picture. The prosecution brought forward multiple charges. Each accusation was supported by documentation, forensic reports, message logs, geolocation data, and witness testimonies. The case revealed an undeniable truth. Jorge Ignacio Palma was not a man who had made a single mistake. He was a man who had caused harm systematically over time. Prosecutors argued that this made him a continuous threat to society and fully justified their request for the maximum possible sentence. Throughout the proceedings, Palma tried to portray himself as a man trapped by circumstance, overwhelmed, broken, and filled with regret. His emotional displays, especially when the name of Marta Calvo Buron was mentioned, seemed calculated, as if performed by someone playing a role rather than expressing genuine emotion. Palma denied all charges. He insisted he never meant to cause harm, that he was under the influence at the time. His story wasn't built on truth, but on an attempt to manipulate public perception. Psychologists called to evaluate him reported signs of narcissism, manipulation, and a complete absence of empathy. At one point, he even shifted blame onto the victims, claiming that everything had been consensual, an assertion completely disproved by testimonies and forensic evidence. Experts described Palma as a man of contradictions. Outwardly, he appeared polished, polite, and confident, someone easy to trust. Each encounter was premeditated. He carefully selected his victims, targeting women in vulnerable situations. In May 2022, Jorge Ignacio Palma was found guilty on all counts, including the murders of Marta Calvo Buron, Arlene Ramos, Marcela Vargas, as well as the assault of several other women. He was sentenced to 159 years in prison for multiple crimes, including murder, violent abuse, and offenses related to banned substances use and distribution. The court determined that Palma had acted deliberately, was fully aware of the potentially lethal consequences of his actions. Significant compensation was ordered for the victims and their families, including €640,000 awarded to Marta Calvo Buron's mother, Marisol, for emotional psychological suffering. The court considered Palma's denial of responsibility, his blaming of the victims, and his complete lack of remorse as factors that worsened his crimes. These significantly increased his sentence, even when victims' bodies were missing or there were no eyewitnesses. Then, instead of wallowing in grief, Marisol transformed her pain into a meaningful purpose. She established an organization in memory of her daughter Marta, to help families impacted by violence and to push for changes in the system. Now, Marta's name represents not only loss, but also strength, defiance, and the pursuit of justice. Marcela Vargas's murder left her children orphaned and unable to properly mourn her. Their lives were shattered. They lost their mother, their normal routines, and their sense of security. While relatives took them in, nothing could truly replace their mother's love. Government support is scarce. Moral support is almost non-existent. Some were too young to grasp what had happened, while others would forever be scarred by that fateful night. Their sorrow was intensified by constant court appearances, interviews, and media attention. These families didn't just lose loved ones, they were pulled into the eye of a tragedy that left lasting scars, especially on the children forced to grow up too soon, forever marked by Palma's crimes. Even though Jorge Ignacio Palma admitted to dismembering Marta and hiding her body, she has never been found. Police searched extensively, including going through trash and landfills, but found nothing. The most devastating aspect for her is that Marta's body was never recovered. The lack of a place to mourn Marta continues to deeply affect Marisol, leaving her with a grief that time cannot mend and preventing her from finding peace. Marisol Bon continues her fight to bring her daughter home, even if only to give her a proper burial. For her, it's not just about closure, it's about restoring a sense of dignity, of final justice. Police have confirmed the investigation remains open and search efforts are ongoing, offering a small but vital glimmer of hope that Marta might still be found. In a small Sicilian town, what began as the story of a fragile young mother struggling to build a family would spiral into one of Italy's most chilling and controversial murder cases. Veronica Panarello, once seen as a devoted wife and caring parent, walked into a police station on the morning of November 29, 2014, to report her 8-year-old son, Loris Stivel, missing. Within hours, his lifeless body was discovered in a ravine, and a community that had long prided itself on peace and tradition was thrown into chaos. Was the boy a victim of a lurking predator, or had the threat come from somewhere far closer to home? Veronica Panarello was a young woman living in southern Italy, burdened with hardships from an early age. At 16, she met David Stivel in a bar and was instantly smitten. They quickly connected. On their very first date, Veronica poured out her life story without holding anything back. The two began dating, and within just 3 months, despite Veronica still being in school, she suggested that they start a family. She was determined to have David's child. He agreed, and they moved in together. Soon after, Veronica discovered she was pregnant. Their first son, Loris Andrea Stivel, was born in 2006. Veronica was only 17 at the time, while David was 21. She already had a tense relationship with her parents, marked by frequent arguments, and the birth of a child out of wedlock only deepened the rift. Still, Veronica managed to project the image of a stable young family. Contrary to the concerns of the older generation, things seemed to go well at first. For a while, Veronica did her best to take care of her baby and prove herself as a mother. Later, Veronica and David officially married. Veronica became pregnant again and gave birth to another boy, Diego. In reality, she remained partly dependent on her parents for support, while David worked as a truck driver. His income was not enough to provide for 4 people, so both families offered as much help as they could, especially financial. Veronica, for her part, dedicated herself entirely to the children and the household. To outsiders, she appeared to be a good wife, thrifty, organized, and attentive. The boys were described as being raised with love. Veronica spent nearly all her time with them, often more like a friend than a mother. Her very young age at motherhood meant she was still going through her own rebellious phase, which frequently led to clashes with her parents. They believed she was too young to be responsible, and their attempts to reason with her often ended in tantrums. The young family lived in Santa Croce Camarina, a small town in Sicily with a population of just about 10,000. It was a quiet, rural setting, and although early motherhood was uncommon, no one could have predicted that such a seemingly ordinary household would become the center of a chilling national tragedy. On November 29, 2014, Veronica Panarello walked into the police station to report her 8-year-old son missing. She claimed that she had dropped Loris off at school early that morning, just as she always did. According to her, he had gone straight through the gates and joined the other children. She then drove Diego to kindergarten, where he was to stay until midday. But when she returned later to collect Loris, he was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, she rushed to the police to file a missing persons report. Officers immediately contacted the school, but none of the teachers or staff had seen Loris that day. Classmates also confirmed that he had not been in the schoolyard or classroom. Some speculated that he might have skipped class, while others whispered about the possibility of a kidnapping. Yet most doubted that the boy would willingly get into a stranger's car. He was far too cautious for that. The question loomed: if Veronica had truly walked her son to the school gates, how could no one else have seen him? At that time, David Stival was working up north as a long-haul truck driver. He was 29 years old, while Veronica was 26. Police quickly contacted him, and he was stunned. His wife hadn't even called him to say Loris was missing. David immediately phoned her. As he raced home in a panic, he came across posts circulating on social media. They showed photos of his wife and child, with the devastating caption, "Loris had been found dead." Loris's body was found only 4 hours after the police report, in a pile of dirt located near an old mill, a few minutes' drive from the Panarello home. An elderly man who was hunting during his usual hike through the forest discovered the body. He noticed something suspicious in the dirt and, upon closer inspection, realized that it was not an accidentally discarded object. He immediately contacted the police to report the discovery. Forensic experts examined the scene. The child's body was unnaturally swollen, his pants were slightly lowered, and he was missing his underwear. Police officers immediately suspected abuse for the crime. However, unlike typical perverts, this person had not only abused his victim, but also killed him, making him doubly dangerous. When local residents learned of the tragedy, panic broke out in the town. People feared that every child could be in the crosshairs of a predator who had emerged into the community. News of the murder quickly spread throughout the country, and the victim was featured on Italy's main television channels. The incident became one of the main news stories of 2014, stirring up public outrage. People demanded that the police catch the criminal and bring him to justice. Detectives worked tirelessly to find the perpetrator. To calm the public, investigators working on the case immediately focused on several oddities. The crime clearly didn't follow the classic pattern of abusers and maniacs. The biggest oddity was that Loris was missing underwear, but the criminal had put the pants back on. Child abusers often collect victims' belongings as trophies, but almost never put the clothes back on after taking them off. Moreover, such cases had never been observed in this area before. The police also paid attention to the deceased's family. Veronica and David were generally considered decent people, known as a loving young family. Believing the family could provide valuable information, investigators interviewed Loris's parents. Police learned that David spent very little time at home as he worked as a driver. The children spent almost all their free time with their mother. Thus, Veronica was often alone without her husband, and she frequently complained about the difficulties associated with her loneliness. Rumors began to spread throughout the town that she had lovers. However, upon investigation, this information could not be confirmed. The police found Veronica to be, according to David's confession, devastated by the tragedy. She cried constantly and refused to eat, eventually becoming exhausted. She was taken to the hospital, where she had to be given special IVs with a nutrient solution. The police who saw her during this period noted that she looked extremely unwell, emotionally broken, which manifested physically. During this period, Loris's younger brother Diego was still living with the family. However, his parents later took him to live with his grandparents because his mother was in an unstable mental state and was neglecting both herself and the child. David supported his wife throughout this time and had to quit his job. Despite the Stival family's profound grief over the loss of their child, investigators decided to bring both parents to the scene where Loris's body was found. Police made video recordings, believing this visit could provide valuable insights. The video showed Veronica to be a mere shadow of her former self, deeply grieving the loss of her son. The list of potential suspects includes the person who discovered Loris's body. How had he managed to find the body so quickly? Investigators launched a large-scale investigation but were unable to find any connection between him and the crime. He successfully passed a polygraph test, had a confirmed alibi for the morning of Loris's disappearance, and his fingerprints were not found on Loris's body. Ultimately, after rigorous investigation, the detectives cleared him of all suspicion, confirming that he had indeed found Loris by chance. At the same time, the investigation had exhausted all apparent leads. With no evidence pointing to a perpetrator, it was decided to call in reinforcements from the Carabinieri in Rome to assist in the investigation. The new investigators, after studying all the materials, began to suspect the mother's involvement in her son's disappearance. They immediately noticed inconsistencies in the family's accounts. Loris's grandparents told investigators that he had mentioned a strange experiment at school, saying his mother had bought plastic zip ties for a class project just one day before he went missing. This seemed suspicious, because plastic cable ties are potentially dangerous and are generally prohibited in schools. When detectives questioned the teachers about this experiment, it turned out that no such activity had been planned and no plastic cable ties were needed. Initially, investigators assumed the child had fabricated the story. However, after receiving the forensic report, they recalled the information. According to the autopsy, the child's time of death was around 9:10 a.m. on the day of his disappearance. The cause of death was strangulation with a thin, rigid object that had been tied around his neck. The marks were consistent with strangulation by plastic cable tie. Investigators then considered a potential connection between these two facts. The forensic expert believed that the murder had been committed somewhere near the location where the body was found. Even the injuries from the fall occurred almost immediately after death, suggesting the victim had been dumped there either dead or near death. Detectives theorized that the child might have wanted the plastic cable ties for some personal reason and had made up the story about needing them for school. Loris would then have carried them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about this? It seemed unlikely that the killer would attack the boy, grab his backpack, and then search it for a murder weapon. All the landfills where waste from Santa Croce Camarina was disposed of were searched. Despite several days of searching the garbage dumps, the police were unable to locate the boy's blue backpack. In addition to the strangulation evidence, the forensic examination revealed a peculiar detail. His pants were lowered. However, no signs of abuse, assault, or traces of DNA from a possible perpetrator were found. From that point on, the police began to question their initial assumptions about the case. They were still searching for the perpetrator, but they began to suspect that this was an atypical crime. The initial profile of the killer, possibly an abuser, no longer seemed to fit. However, at this stage of the investigation, the information was too chaotic to form a cohesive picture. The solution became obvious. The detectives decided to trace the path the mother and child took on the day of the murder. On the day of the murder, Veronica and Loris traveled along the main street, which had many houses and stores with CCTV cameras. Collecting and reviewing the recordings took considerable time. Law enforcement agencies looked for evidence of a third person following them in a black Volkswagen. There were several oddities. Firstly, they couldn't find any footage of the boy entering the school. Despite Veronica insisted that she had accompanied him almost to the entrance, it became clear that she was lying. They hadn't gone to school that morning. Investigators continued to analyze footage from the entire area to find clues. They saw that at one of the intersections Veronica was supposed to pass, she turned towards a small church near where the victim was later found. This seemed strange, as she had used a different road for many years. What could have made Veronica change her route on the very day her son went missing? This raised suspicions. At this stage, the police decided not to disclose the information to avoid alarming Veronica. Instead, they began to consider her a suspect. Experienced officers decided to immediately verify her statements. Veronica was asked to drive with the investigators along the same route she had taken on the day of Loris's death, to show them everything personally. The police already knew the route, having reconstructed it using CCTV footage. Veronica agreed, and they began to reconstruct the events, driving the police car with Veronica to the crucial intersection where she had changed her route. She lied again, stating that she had taken her usual route. Now, there was no longer any doubt that she was deliberately hiding something, making her the prime suspect because of her lies. Therefore, the detectives decided to conduct a search of the Steibel family's home and took Veronica to the station for questioning. Realizing that the police considered her a likely killer, Veronica began to protest, claiming that she would never harm her son. However, the investigators were unconvinced. The interrogation stretched on for several hours, but Veronica stubbornly maintained her innocence. During the questioning, she admitted to dropping her eldest son off hundreds of meters from the school because she was in a hurry, forcing the boy to walk the rest of the way alone. She suggested someone could have attacked him on the way. When asked about her presence near the ravine on the morning of Loris's death, Veronica denied being there and claimed to be unfamiliar with the area. This, of course, was a lie. Veronica's sister confirmed that they had frequented the ravine as children and knew it well. Furthermore, security camera footage corroborated her presence there. Detectives spent hours reviewing video footage to confirm their suspicions and uncover additional clues. The father of Loris, David, was brought into the case. Initially, he refused to believe his wife was involved in their son's murder. He even identified Veronica and their 2 children in the security footage from the morning of the incident, showing them leaving the house. However, instead of taking her eldest son to school, she brought him back home. A figure resembling Loris appeared briefly in the footage, but then disappeared from view. Deviating from her usual routine, she didn't park the car in front of the house, but backed it into the garage around 9 a.m. Detectives believed the boy was murdered during this time, while he was absent from school. While Veronica was in the garage, she was doing something out of the camera's view. This seemed highly suspicious, as if she were deliberately concealing something. According to her account, she took the older child to school, then took the younger one to kindergarten. Afterward, she returned home and went about her day. She insisted that he could have been kidnapped right in front of the school. However, the police didn't believe her. They saw in the camera footage how at 9:23 she left the house again, and just 2 minutes later, she headed down the road to the old mill where Loris's body would later be found. She returned home at 9:38 and was already guaranteed to be alone. Veronica then went to a cooking class she regularly attended. It started at 10 a.m., so she left early so as not to be late and not give herself away. She behaved normally, so no one noticed anything unusual. GPS data from Veronica's phone and car confirmed her route, a fact revealed to the detectives. Unfortunately, at that point, the police still lacked sufficient evidence to charge her. Investigators continued to gather information, but even with Veronica under arrest, they had no concrete evidence, testimony, or recordings proving she killed her son. It seemed the case was about to crack. But then a female police officer stationed near the school contacted the station. She claimed Veronica had dropped her child off in front of the school that morning, seemingly contradicting the security footage. However, investigators didn't blindly trust the colleague's statement, nor did they discount the camera recordings. Given that the suspect followed this route every day and performed the same actions, the officer could have simply confused the dates. At that time, Veronica was behind bars and literally screamed about her innocence. The detectives considered depression or emotional instability the only plausible explanation for Veronica's possible involvement. In fact, she suffered from severe depression, a condition that was exacerbated by her incarceration. The investigation soon stalled. David visited Veronica again. Like all visits within the prison, this meeting was recorded. For the first time, Veronica admitted that she remembered not taking Loris to school on the day he disappeared. She expressed difficulty articulating her thoughts, describing her state of mind as unusual. According to Veronica, she felt disconnected from reality that morning, like she was in a fog. From fragments of memories, she pieced together how she had taken her youngest child to kindergarten. After that, she returned home where Loris was supposed to be. She had left him there because Loris did not want to go to class that day. But upon returning, Veronica did not find the boy at home. In a strange state, she thought she had taken the boy to school, but then realized she was wrong. When she arrived to pick up her child from school, he was gone. The police, of course, didn't believe this new version of events, but they were convinced they were on the right track. This was nearly the confession they had sought for a year, to bring the killer to justice. Her excuses about memory loss were considered a transparent attempt to conceal her guilt. Everyone shared this point of view, given Veronica's genuinely alarming condition. Unfortunately, the youngest child was too young to provide reliable testimony to the police. Despite their certainty of her involvement in the murder, the investigators decided to play along with her, suggesting that Veronica return her home, believing it might unlock new memories. They led her through the rooms as they had been on the day of Loris's death. When Veronica entered Loris's room, a theatrical display began. She spoke in her son's voice and began to imitate conversations she had had with him that morning. The detectives, observing her lack of genuine emotion, became convinced that they were dealing with a pathological liar and manipulator. Ultimately, Veronica offered a new version of events, one that many still believe. Although the police officers weren't entirely convinced by her story, Veronica confessed that on the day of the incident, she returned home from kindergarten with her younger child and went to wash the bottles. Her eldest son, Loris, didn't want to go to school, so she allowed him to stay home that day. Loris was in his room while she did chores. She claimed she didn't hear anything suspicious, but when she checked on him later, she found his lifeless body already turning blue with plastic cable ties around his neck. She theorized that he was probably playing with them, attempting to tighten them like a necklace. According to her account, he froze, his eyes wide with fright. Why would an 8-year-old child put cable ties around his neck and tighten them progressively without calling for help? He then instinctively pulled on one of the ends, believing it would loosen the ties, but instead, he only tightened them further. Veronica said she couldn't tear the ties apart with her bare hands. Desperate, she ran to the kitchen for scissors. When she returned and cut the ties, the boy showed no signs of life. He was unconscious and not breathing. Veronica stated that she began to panic. She grabbed her cell phone, tried to call emergency services. However, she was shaking so violently that she couldn't dial the number. Her fingers fumbled on the buttons, the numbers blurred before her eyes. After this failed attempt, Veronica realized she would be blamed for Loris's death. In a state of shock and irrationality, she decided to dispose of his body. Later, a forensic examination confirmed the presence of scratches on Loris's face and neck, consistent with attempts to remove the plastic cable ties with his fingernails. It had cut too deeply into the skin to be easily ripped off. It was also possible that pulling on one end of the ties herself, in her attempt to free him, further aggravated the situation, completely cutting off his oxygen supply. At this point, the police decided to revisit the information and, if possible, elicit new memories. Veronica and her husband, David, were taken back to the scene where Loris was found. There, Veronica admitted to dumping Loris's body. However, she maintained that she hadn't harmed him herself and couldn't explain why Loris wasn't wearing underwear. This detail contradicted her story and raised serious doubts. She later recalled that the ravine was so deep that, as she struggled to turn his body, his pants came off and he tumbled to the bottom. At the trial, the prosecutor challenged Veronica's confession. Her unusual behavior was particularly concerning. Veronica had parked the car in the garage in an awkward way, seemingly to discreetly load the body into it. But this occurred at a time when, according to her confession, she couldn't have known about her son's death. The prosecution argued that this indicated premeditation, as she would have parked this way after knowing he was dead. The defense continued to argue that the mother did not kill the child, but that he killed himself accidentally. Veronica understood the seriousness of what happened. She was scared and shocked that she was involved. So, she disposed of the body. However, she could not answer one of the key questions. The prosecution could not understand why she took off Loris's underwear and then put on his pants. According to Veronica, she simply did not remember this. The prosecutor considered her actions an attempt to stage an attack on the boy by an abuser in order to misdirect the investigation. During the trial, an unexpected twist emerged. Veronica confided in her mother that her father-in-law, Andrea Stivel, had killed Loris. She alleged that she had been having an affair with Andrea and that Loris had caught them in the act that day, threatening to tell his father. In a fit of rage, Andrea attacked and strangled him. Despite this bizarre turn of events, law enforcement was compelled to investigate the allegation. They re-examined the CCTV footage but found no evidence that any of the men had entered the house that morning. However, the footage did show Veronica leaving the house around 9:03 a.m. with what appeared to be a dark silhouette in the back seat. The Carabinieri were then forced to consult specialists to analyze the video footage, but the specialists claimed that the silhouette was not a person's shadow, it was simply glare on the car windows. Andrea himself denied both the affair with his son's wife and the murder of Loris, calling it another lie from a crazy woman, adding that he had a confirmed alibi. Furthermore, there was no correspondence or even phone calls between the alleged lovers. Veronica's behavior suggested a case involving a person with mental health issues. Everyone emphasized her strange demeanor. More than one detective recalled that during one of the interrogations, Veronica suddenly began to sing, and her calm, loud speech repeatedly alternated with indistinct muttering under her breath, accompanied by an empty gaze. She seemed to periodically lose touch with reality. She would even pretend to smoke an imaginary cigarette. Veronica's mother had previously stated that Veronica had mental health issues and had been abused by boys. At the age of 14, she took her own life by drinking bleach after an argument with friends at school. The following year, she once again tried to end her life. Veronica received treatment in a psychiatric clinic. On one occasion, she called her mother, asking to be picked up because a nurse had allegedly abused her. However, these accusations were unsubstantiated, and no one believed her. The trial lasted for 4 years due to constant postponements and additional investigations. After 3 trials, the case was closed. She was convicted of premeditated murder and concealment of a body. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. Another scene unfolded. The child's grandfather, whom Veronica had implicated, was present in the courtroom. Veronica did not agree with the verdict, so she stood up and began again to accuse the man of the same absurd things she had said before. At the trial, she was removed from the courtroom. Loris's father, David, claimed after the trial that his life was ruined because he lost his son, his wife, and his job. The man is still unsure whether Veronica was responsible for the boy's death. He was perplexed as to what could have motivated the murder of his son. David had never witnessed his wife display violence towards children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he tries to live for the sake of his youngest son, whose upbringing his parents help him with. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Raynella Dossett Leith. Raynella Dossett Leith was born on October 25, 1948, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a small, isolated town originally established for workers at the nearby nuclear power plant. Her parents worked at the plant, and because the town was isolated, it was safer than many other American cities. Children were free to play outside. Raynella was a bright student and did well in school. She successfully enrolled at East Tennessee State University in Knoxville, where she studied nursing. There, she met a very ambitious young man named Ed Dossett, who aspired to become a corporate executive or start his own business and even had political ambitions. He was a quiet, friendly young man, and they both grew up in rural Tennessee. In 1970, the young couple got married and moved to the suburbs of Knoxville. Ed Dossett owned a large, old family farm that they renovated with the help of contractors, turning it into the perfect home. After graduating from college, Raynella began working as a nurse at a local hospital and worked her way up to the position of senior nurse. By 1975, she had completed her law degree and begun a successful legal career. In 1978, when the Knoxville County Attorney General retired, Ed Dossett ran for the position and was elected. Raynella played a major role in his success, as he credited much of it to her support. In 1978, the couple welcomed their first daughter. In 1983, they had a son, followed by another daughter in 1985. After learning that she was pregnant with her first child, Raynella decided to quit her job and become a full-time housewife, as her husband had a good income and she also helped with the farm work. During this time, Ed Dossett served as the Knoxville County Attorney and worked with a secretary named Kay Clift Walker, with whom he had a secret affair. Although Kay had a family of her own, they still spent weekends and holidays together. When Kay became pregnant, she had to quit her job due to her increased responsibilities, but her intimate encounters with Ed Dossett continued. In such a conservative county, having an extramarital relationship was unacceptable for a public servant. Ed Dossett and Kay chose to end their affair to avoid damaging their reputations. However, the situation was more complicated than it seemed. Those who knew Raynella recognized her as a controlling and powerful person. People often did not enjoy interacting with her, let alone befriending her. Ed Dossett's close friends and family knew that his marital problems began soon after they got married, largely due to Raynella's desire to control every aspect of their lives. Many later understood why Ed Dossett decided to leave. During a meeting, Ed Dossett began to experience severe stomach pain. His assistant noticed that he was constantly holding his stomach and seemed unwell. When asked about his health, Ed Dossett expressed that he believed his wife was trying to harm him, implying that she was poisoning his food. However, when offered help, he insisted that he could handle it on his own. By September 1991, his condition had worsened to the point that he had to be hospitalized. Although he was skeptical of his wife's intentions, he later revealed that these fears were unfounded. Doctors performed a series of tests and discovered a malignant tumor in his small intestine and liver. Unfortunately, the cancer was already at an advanced stage, with metastases spreading to nearby organs in the abdominal cavity. Ed Dossett returned home anxiously and shared his diagnosis with Raynella. He later confided to family members that she responded calmly to the news but chose not to discuss the illness. She believed it was better to keep the situation private, thinking it would allow her husband to continue working for as long as possible. She felt that staying active would help prolong his life and secretly hoped for a miracle that would aid in his recovery. Those who knew Raynella well speculated that her motives were financial, believing she pushed him to work until the end to maintain a steady income. By March 1992, Ed Dossett's health had declined significantly, and it was clear he was losing the battle against his illness. During this time, he wanted his family close, so he contacted loved ones, including his cousin, with whom he had a close relationship until the end of his life. The cousin lived in another state and drove over 700 kilometers to visit Ed Dossett. Raynella refused to let his cousin into the house, leaving him no choice but to leave. That evening, Raynella wrote a letter explaining her actions, claiming that Ed Dossett's serious condition made it impossible for him to receive visitors anymore, and that his appearance might scare them. However, no one found this explanation convincing. Just a few days later, Ed Dossett himself asked his family to visit him one last time, indicating that he did not care about his appearance. The next day, Raynella insisted that Ed Dossett return to work. Despite being in excruciating pain and barely able to move, Ed chose to follow his wife's wishes and continue working until the very end. After only one day of work, he was forced to stop. Now bedridden, Ed Dossett was on near-constant morphine to manage his unbearable pain, and doctors estimated he had only a few weeks to live. No one expected anything unusual to happen to Ed Dossett, who was in critical condition and required medical assistance to stay alive. On the morning of July 9, a 911 call was received requesting police and paramedics to Ranella's home for assistance. When the police arrived, they found Ranella in a panic, running around the body of Ed Dossett, who was lying on the ground. Ranella explained that her husband had gone out to check on their cattle. After a while, she heard noises indicating that the cattle were agitated. She tried to call out to Ed Dossett, but there was no response. Fearing he had been trampled by the frightened animals, she grabbed her pistol and fired several shots into the air to scare them away. Initially, the police believed the incident to be an accident. Ranella was taken to the police station for standard questioning. However, as the conversation progressed, her account of her husband's death began to raise suspicions. During the questioning, the police learned that Ed Dossett had a serious illness and had suddenly wanted to check on the cattle, which seemed odd given his poor health and difficulty walking. The police were puzzled as to why Ranella had allowed him to go alone to the herd in such a weakened state, and why she had shown no concern when he took so long to return. Ranella remained in the house until she heard a loud noise, at which point she discovered her husband lying on the ground. Ed Dossett had been trampled and was covered in scratches and hoof marks. Ranella administered first aid and CPR. Having worked in a hospital, she was well versed in these techniques, but unfortunately, nothing seemed to help. As her story unfolded, more bizarre details emerged. Realizing her husband was beyond saving, she called for emergency services, but there was no response. She tried to contact the local hospital directly, but she did not remember their phone number. The police found this suspicious, as she had worked as a senior nurse at a local health center for many years and should have known the number by heart. Despite the inconsistencies, her account was considered credible. She explained that she had not been working for the organization for long and had forgotten the necessary phone numbers. She also mentioned feeling scared and shocked. Eventually, she contacted the local market director, a friend of hers, and asked him to call for help. He then reached out to the emergency services. Unfortunately, the condition of the body made it difficult to determine the cause of death at first glance, so a thorough autopsy was required. Forensic experts arrived to investigate the scene, but they found no physical evidence. Ultimately, Ed Dossett's death was ruled an accident, and the case was closed. However, the real story was just beginning. Those who knew Ed Dossett well realized that in his final days, he was barely conscious for more than a few minutes due to constant pain and required injections of morphine to relieve it. It was strange that he suddenly decided to leave the house to check on the cows. If he tried to stand, he could barely do so on his own. His legs had weakened in the last days of his life. The medical examiner found numerous internal injuries and broken bones on the man. Furthermore, there were hoof marks on his skin, which corroborated Ranella's story. Ed Dossett's relatives knew that his life insurance policy included a clause that doubled the payout if he died in an accident rather than from natural causes such as cancer. Although his wife would still receive a payout, it would be significantly less. Therefore, it was in her best interest to present her husband's death as an accident. Since the authorities classified his death as an accident, she could collect double the compensation. This is why Ranella initially tried to hide her husband's illness from the police. Ed Dossett's relatives decided to investigate the circumstances surrounding his death, discovering inconsistencies in the case. Ed Dossett's blood had almost no morphine, which was surprising given his regular use of high doses. He had terminal cancer and could only manage his pain with large amounts of painkillers. The forensic expert confirmed that the morphine level was 0, indicating that he had not taken any medication for at least a day. However, it seemed that Ed Dossett could not move without painkillers. Despite this, the official inquest was closed. It is believed that Ed Dossett may have staged his own death as he was nearing the end of his life and wanted to go on his own terms. Perhaps he was worried about his family and considered this his last wish, but it is difficult to understand why he did not at least take a painkiller to alleviate his suffering before staging this incident. All of this creates a confusing picture with contradictory details. At the funeral, Ed Dossett's friends confirmed their suspicions about Raynella. Eyewitnesses noted that she seemed carefree and even cheerful, which was surprising for a grieving widow. Rather than mourning her husband, she appeared to treat the event as a social gathering, mingling and chatting with guests. This behavior was especially strange, given her usual rudeness toward others following her husband's death. It seemed that she had finally been relieved of the burden of caring for him. She had not worked for a long time, had received a large sum of money, and felt no need to find employment. Instead, she chose to spend most of her time with her children. However, Raynella soon grew tired of this lifestyle. She and her children began visiting a nearby swimming pool owned by a man named David Lead. David was a well-known figure in the local community. He was married and had a daughter. Raynella and David had little in common. Raynella was well-educated, while David had dropped out of school at 19 without graduating. He eventually became a hairdresser and opened his own beauty salon, gaining recognition in town. David was always proud of his appearance and underwent several cosmetic surgeries to look younger. Unfortunately, his satisfaction with his looks did not last long. One day, an accident caused a large piece of debris to hit his eye, disfiguring his face and leaving him partially blind. Since then, he has worn sunglasses. As Raynella and her children spent more time at the pool, they grew closer to David. He began an affair with Raynella, which his wife eventually discovered. She filed for divorce, but by then, David was deeply in love with Raynella and indifferent to the divorce proceedings. They quickly divorced, and in January 1993, Raynella married David. He moved to her farm just 6 months after Ed Dossett's death, which sparked new rumors and gossip in the community about her marrying her late husband's friend, especially considering the suspicious circumstances surrounding Ed Dossett's death. The situation became a real scandal. Initially, she and David ignored the questions and gossip, but eventually, the rumors died down. Soon after, she began to display her domineering and harsh personality. David's daughter, who had seen him driving his pickup truck in a bad mood, asked her father what had happened. He told her that he had argued with Raynella but did not want to share more details. His daughter was shocked, as it was the first time she had seen him like that. In 1994, a heartbreaking tragedy struck Raynella. Her son died tragically. He and his sister had been driving with a temporary license that allowed them to drive as long as a licensed adult was present. However, that day, the boy was driving without adult supervision, lost control of the car, and crashed into an oncoming vehicle. The boy, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown through the windshield and suffered serious injuries, dying before the ambulance arrived. Raynella was taken to the police station for questioning after the incident. Several witnesses stated that there were no adults in the car when the boy was driving, but Raynella claimed she was in the car with the children and that the tragic accident happened before she could react. Despite this, the police believed Raynella's story and chose not to prosecute her. If the case had been thoroughly investigated, Raynella could have faced consequences that could have prevented further events from occurring. However, her persuasive speaking skills helped her avoid further legal trouble. Following these events, divorce proceedings began between Kay Clift Walker, Ed Dossett's former secretary, and her current husband, Steve Walker. Her husband was shocked to discover that their second child with Kay was actually Ed Dossett's. Raynella, who knew about the affair, contacted Steve to discuss the situation. The day after they met, she requested another meeting to discuss important documents. Raynella invited Steve to her farm to review the documents confirming the paternity of all of Kay's children with Ed Dossett. In a shocking turn of events, Raynella pulled out a loaded pistol and began attacking Steve. Fortunately, he dodged the bullets and escaped unharmed. Steve considered calling the police for assistance, but Raynella acted first and called them herself. In a panic, she falsely claimed that Steve had brought a weapon to her home and threatened her. The police quickly discovered the truth, leading to Raynella being charged with attempted murder. After a preliminary hearing, she was released on $200,000 bail. Ranella later accepted a plea deal, which resulted in a sentence of 6 years of probation and 100 days of community service. Meanwhile, Ranella continues to research her inheritance after David's death. His daughter, who was only entitled to 10% of the estate, was supposed to inherit the house and the rest of the estate. In January 2000, David began to suffer from various health problems, including hallucinations, high cholesterol, and even a stroke. Ranella handled the situation by preventing family members from visiting David and limiting contact with his daughter and their nephew. Fortunately, David recovered and was discharged from the hospital, but his health problems forced him to quit his business. By this time, he was showing signs of dementia. During a visit to a neurologist, he vaguely recalled an incident involving suffocation with a pillow, but the neurologist dismissed it as another hallucination. On March 13, David's mother was hospitalized for cancer. Unexpectedly, Ranella visited her at the hospital and then contacted David's daughter, asking her to visit her father. She expressed that she had left a plate of food and medicine on the bedside table, but was worried that David might not finish eating. It was unclear why she suddenly became so anxious and how she knew he had even touched the food. The call was strange because, in recent months, Ranella had done everything she could to limit David's daughter's contact with her father and prevent them from communicating. Additionally, she had never visited her mother-in-law, so her appearance at the hospital took everyone by surprise. David's daughter then went to the house to check on her father, but no one answered her phone calls or opened the door. She eventually found David with a head injury and quickly called the police. When the police arrived, they found Ranella immediately discussing her decision to end David's life. She insisted he had good reasons for this, citing his long-term battle with depression. However, David loved his daughter very much, and his mental health seemed stable because he was managing his illness well. Ranella told the police that on the day he died, she had left him food on the bedside table before visiting her mother-in-law. Before leaving, he had spoken to her and kissed her goodbye. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but now she realized that was his way of saying goodbye to her for the last time. Ranella claimed that David's actions constituted a voluntary departure from life, but she also mentioned that it was the first time she had seen a weapon. However, given her dubious past full of lies and contradictions, few believed her. There were some strange details in this case. At the crime scene, 3 shots were fired, the first missed, the second was fatal, and the third also missed David. Additionally, 1 shot came from a different type of weapon that was not found at the crime scene. David was wounded on the left side of his head, despite being right-handed and having lost most of his vision in his left eye due to a previous traffic accident. This suggests that he would have struggled to aim accurately at that part of his head. David's family believes that Ranella was responsible for the murder. It seemed that the Ranella might eventually be brought to justice, but she acted quickly by arranging for the cremation of her second husband, David. This move destroyed much of the evidence that could have been used in court, making it impossible to conduct a proper autopsy. David's daughter was devastated by her father's death, and even more shocked to discover that he had left her virtually nothing. Despite efforts to bring the police into the case, 3 years passed without any progress. Ranella manipulated those around her with her money and status, and she lied to the police several times. Finally, in 2006, when David's daughter realized that she could not obtain justice through government agencies, she decided to hire a private investigator. Her goal was to seek justice and prevent Ranella from gaining an undeserved inheritance from David. She was certain that her father would never do this to her. It was all a setup. Private investigators uncovered clear evidence of Ranella's guilt, leading to the reopening of the official investigation into David's death. The police finally took the evidence against Ranella seriously and thoroughly examined the cases surrounding the deaths of her 2 husbands. The toxicology report on Ed Dossett's death revealed an error. In fact, there was a dangerously high level of morphine in his system which could have been fatal. With such a high concentration of the painkiller, he would not have been able to move, let alone care for his cows. In 2006, Raynella was charged with the murder of Ed Dossett. It became clear that his death was no accident. She had discreetly contacted a funeral home and paid for her second husband's cremation, raising suspicions that she was trying to hide the evidence. As a result, Raynella faced charges of premeditated murder. However, she portrayed herself as the victim, convincing several people in the process and manipulating the trial in her favor. Raynella did not plead guilty to the murder. She was released on $5,000 bail, and her formal trial was set for March 2009. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision, with only one juror believing she was innocent, while the others believed she had planned to kill her husband for financial gain. As a result of this impasse, the case was retried in 2010. During the retrial, experts revealed that the bullet that killed David Leith was fired from a distance of at least 30 centimeters, too far for a suicide attempt. David did not have the arm length necessary to wield the weapon at that distance. Fingerprints found on the murder weapon also suggested that the scene had been staged after the crime. Raynella visited David's mother at the hospital to establish an alibi. She tried to contact David's daughter, locate her father, and call the police. The prosecutor argued that David had been given a cocktail of drugs typically used for surgical patients, which only nurses had access to. On January 25, 2010, after 2 days of deliberations, a jury found Raynella Dossett Leith guilty of first-degree murder for David's death. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. Shortly after the verdict, charges related to the death of Raynella's first husband, Ed Dossett, were dismissed for reasons that remain unclear. In early 2011, it was discovered that the verdict had been entered while the judge was a drug addict, which may have influenced the outcome. On the plus side, David's will was found to be invalid because his illness had impaired his mental capacity. As a result, half of the estate was confiscated, and Raynella returned David's assets to his daughter. Her lawyers attempted to appeal the case, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The defense continued to fight and achieved a breakthrough in January 2017 when Raynella returned to court. The prosecution argued that Raynella's murder plan fell apart when she fired the first shot, which dramatically changed the situation. The second shot was believed to be the fatal one. David's daughter testified that Raynella had been acting strangely and unusually on the day of the incident. The prosecution contended that Raynella's odd behavior was an attempt to create an alibi for herself. Steve Walker, Kay's husband, who had been attacked by Raynella earlier, also spoke at the trial. He stated that Raynella clearly intended to kill him and even shouted about her intentions. He believed that he was only saved by luck. He was furious that Raynella had escaped punishment and that she believed she could act without consequences. It appeared that Raynella picked up the weapon again and attacked her second husband. To further support her claim that David had taken his own life, the defense brought an expert into the courtroom. The defense expert demonstrated to the jury how David Leith could have fired all 3 shots. Ultimately, the judge acquitted Raynella Dossett Leith, stating that there was no evidence to prove her guilt. She noted that no blood or gunpowder residue was found on David's body and that Raynella had an alibi for the time of his death because she was in the hospital. There was no evidence to prove that Raynella committed the crime or that she was the last person to see David alive. The defense celebrated the verdict, while the prosecution and jury were disappointed. Raynella, who has repeatedly evaded the justice system, remains free. Now, 76, she lives on her farm, and no one dares to question her about the deaths of her 2 husbands. Her children support her. Unfortunately, it seems the truth about these tragic deaths will never be discovered, but many believe she was directly involved in the deaths of both husbands. Bridget Frisbee was born in December 1993 in Katy, Texas, USA. Shortly after her birth, her parents abandoned her and she was placed in an orphanage. When Bridget was 18 months old, Robert Frisbee and Catherine visited the orphanage. After years of trying without being able to have children, they decided to make happy the baby abandoned by her parents. Catherine had always longed for a daughter, and from the moment she first met Bridget, she felt a deep connection. Without hesitation, Robert and Catherine decided to adopt Bridget. From then on, they providing Bridget with a family full of love and protection. Bridget was an active and kind-hearted child. From a young age, she developed a passion for horseback riding, poetry, and painting. Her positive and friendly nature helped her make many friends. Her adoptive parents often wondered how her biological parents could have abandoned such a wonderful child. However, despite her cheerful demeanor, Bridget faced significant challenges throughout her life. When Bridget was 10 years old, her adoptive mother passed away after battling a long-term illness for several years, despite always being cared for and encouraged by family. Catherine's death was a devastating loss for Bridget, who had seen Catherine as her real mother. During this difficult period, father and daughter grew closer, supporting each other as they navigated their grief. Robert deeply loved his daughter, and over the years, they built a warm and trusting relationship. As Bridget grew older, her rebellious nature became more and more evident. Robert struggled to keep up with her boundless energy, but she continued to embrace life with enthusiasm. Despite their differences, they maintained a close and loving relationship. Bridget was an active and lively student. She excelled academically and had ambitious dreams for the future, much to her father's delight. She aspired to attend college and build an independent life. On April 3, 2011, a group of teenagers were riding motorcycles along the edge of a Texas forest. This was a strip of land planted near the family's home. The area was usually used for riding dirt bikes and ATVs. Towards the end of the trip, the young athletes saw something suspicious off to the side of the trail. Venturing slightly into the woods, they made a horrifying discovery: a human body. Realizing the importance of preserving evidence, the group refrained from disturbing the scene. They observed blood on the girl's clothes and head, and it appeared that someone had attempted to hide the body by covering it with branches and leaves. However, the concealment was so poorly done that the body was visible even from a considerable distance. The police were immediately called to the scene, where the high school students waited for their arrival. None of the teens recognized the girl. The officers discovered that the victim had no identification, making it impossible to determine her identity at the time. During a cursory inspection of the area, the detectives assumed that the massacre had been carried out right there. The victim had been attacked and left in the forest. A forensic examination later confirmed that there were no signs of abuse, violence, and all of her belongings, including valuables, were still with her. This ruled out robbery and abuse assault as motives, so they suspect that the attack was related to personal hostility or jealousy. The police immediately investigated the victim's identity. They noticed the victim appeared to be just under 20 years old. She was found lying on the ground, partially covered with branches and dirt. A large wound to the head was the only visible injury, indicating a fatal blow that killed the young schoolgirl on the spot. The wound was caused by a 9mm bullet at close range which passed through her head. Near the body, investigators discovered an empty 9mm ammunition box. This was the only clue with which the detectives had to start searching for the culprit of the tragedy. While examining the crime scene, investigators noticed another peculiar detail. A few meters from the body, a small patch of the forest floor had its top layer of soil removed, leaving a bare spot. It appeared as though someone had started digging, but stopped abruptly. The reason for this was unclear. It was possible the killer had intended to bury the body but was interrupted or frightened away. However, the police acknowledged that this detail might have been unrelated to the girl's murder. To identify the deceased, investigators began reaching out to local residents. They went door to door, speaking with people who lived near the forest. News of the brutal murder quickly spread through the community, causing widespread concern. The police used the media to inform the public about the incident, which had occurred just a few hundred meters from some homes, leaving families horrified. Such a crime was unprecedented in their peaceful area. Residents were asked if they had noticed any suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar individuals heading toward the forest or behaving strangely. Meanwhile, deputies from the sheriff's department visited dozens of homes and interviewed numerous witnesses. However, no valuable information emerged on the first day of the investigation. Just as the officers were beginning to lose hope of finding a helpful lead, a woman from a nearby settlement provided a significant clue. She explained that the night before the body was found, she had been relaxing with friends in her backyard. Between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m., she heard a loud noise resembling an explosion. Her friends also confirmed hearing the same sound. According to the witnesses' recollections, that night, no one attached much importance to this extraneous noise, since she lived next to a forest area and knew that it could have been hunters. Moreover, the noise seemed distant, and she wasn't even sure if it was a bullet sound. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, no additional information surfaced. The police returned to the station and began searching their database to determine if the murdered woman was listed as missing. Given the circumstances, it was likely her details had been added only a few days earlier. Unfortunately, during these checks, officers were unable to identify the victim found in the forest. The case took a turn the next day. On the morning of April 4, 2011, Robert Frisbee went to the sheriff's department to report that he hadn't been able to contact his 17-year-old daughter Bridget for over a day. He was deeply concerned, especially after hearing about a body discovered in the nearby forest not far from their home. At this time, the identity of the body remained unknown, so detectives immediately communicated with Robert. He revealed that he had been unable to reach his adopted daughter Bridget through her mobile phone or social media since the previous evening. Bridget had planned to spend the night at a friend's house 2 days before Robert reported her missing to the police. Robert believed she was mature enough to make such plans, and assumed she had intended to meet her boyfriend that night. He didn't object to her having fun. However, after leaving home, Bridget failed to contact her father. She didn't confirm her arrival, let him know how she was, or even say goodnight. This lack of communication was unusual, as their family shared a warm and trusting relationship. According to Robert, such behavior seemed uncharacteristic and caused concern. Robert was aware of an unwritten rule often followed by the police. They are unlikely to act on a disappearance reported earlier than 24 hours after the person goes missing. With this in mind, he decided to wait before going to the police station. During this time, he repeatedly tried contacting his daughter on her mobile phone and reaching out to her friends, but all his efforts were met with silence, without any clue. When Robert provided detectives with a description of his daughter, they immediately noted Bridget's striking resemblance to the body they had found. Robert was shown photographs from the scene of the incident and heartbreakingly confirmed that it was Bridget. She was wearing the same clothes she had on when she left home. The discovery was an emotional devastation for Robert. Years earlier, he had lost his wife to a serious illness and still deeply missed her. His daughter had been his source of hope and joy, but now that light was gone too. With this confirmation, the victim was officially identified. The police then questioned Robert to piece together the events. Robert said that he last saw his daughter on April 2, 2011, when she was still at home. He had just bought her a pair of soft, blue leggings, which he tried on before going out for a walk. That evening, Bridget's friend, Kendall Suo, came over for dinner with the family. After the meal, the two girls asked Robert to take them to a party. He agreed, but when they arrived, they discovered that the club was closed to young people. Unable to attend, Robert took the two girls home at around 10 p.m. Kendall left shortly after, picked up by another young man who planned to return home by midnight. Bridget and Kendall had planned to go to the bus stop to meet Bridget's boyfriend. However, Robert did not wait for the young man to arrive and went to bed. He set his alarm for midnight, and when he woke up, he found Bridget still at home. She told him that her friend was late, which worried her. Robert reassured his daughter and told her to go to bed. After seeing Bridget start getting ready for bed, he locked the door and went back to sleep. At around 3 a.m., Robert woke up feeling uneasy. He checked around the house and realized that Bridget was not there. Thinking she might have gone out with friends, he left the garage door unlocked so she could get inside without waking him. When he tried to call her to ask when she would be home, he realized that he couldn't find his phone. He thought that his daughter might have taken his mobile phone so as not to leave home without a means of communication. He tried using the internet and social media to contact her, but she didn't respond to his calls or messages. Concerned, Robert attempted to track his phone's location through GPS to ensure his daughter was safe, but he couldn't manage to do so. His anxiety grew as he realized she was unlikely to stick to her curfew. He decided to wait until morning, hoping she would return and resolve the situation on her own. Unfortunately, when he woke up on next day, Bridget was still not home. Robert began calling several of her friends and contacts, but no one could tell him exactly where she was or what had happened. By that evening, he read online that a group of teenagers on motorcycles had discovered the body of an unidentified girl near his family home. This news made Robert even more anxious. Although he tried to push away the distressing thoughts, the possibility that his daughter might be the victim tormented him. The next morning, he went to the police station and confirmed that the murdered girl was indeed his daughter. The devastating news left him shattered. He became unable to sleep or focus on work and even started keeping a loaded weapon by his bedside. After Robert's testimony, the detectives finally had their first lead. The suspect was Kendall So, a school friend of Bridget's, with whom she had spoken on the evening before her disappearance. Bridget's father stated that he had known Kendall for a long time and had never observed any signs of aggression or dangerous behavior in him. According to Robert, Kendall was a responsible high school student with no history of criminal activity or bad influences. He was well behaved, a good student, and always treated Bridget with respect. Her father felt confident trusting his daughter with Kendall, believing she was safe in his company. Robert was certain that Kendall could not be the killer. In contrast, Robert believed that a more likely suspect was Bridget's ex-boyfriend, Vali Jonathan Eason. From the start, Bridget and Jonathan had a troubled relationship. Jonathan was a bad influence and was suspected of using soft, banned substance. He was frequently involved in problematic incidents and had a history of provoking conflicts. From the beginning of their acquaintance, he often displayed threatening behavior. Later, a third person came into the picture, Zach Richards, another old friend of Bridget's, with whom she had started dating shortly before her death. Based on Robert's testimony, investigators quickly identified several suspects who needed to be thoroughly investigated. Detectives immediately began questioning these young men to determine their whereabouts at the time of the murder. The first person they approached was Kendall, one of the last people to see Bridget alive. Kendall had no prior issues with the law. When contacted by the police, he willingly agreed to come to the station and provide his statement. He confirmed Robert's account, explaining how he visited Bridget's house and then went to the club with Bridget. According to Kendall, he left the house shortly after Robert dropped them off at the club. He claimed that their plans had suddenly changed because another friend was to join them. Kendall expressed his willingness to cooperate with the investigation and agreed to provide DNA samples and fingerprints as needed. He also mentioned that on the evening in question, Bridget was upset due to a recent argument with her ex-boyfriend, Jonathan Eason. Bridget and Jonathan had been in a relationship for several months, but it had been troubled from the start. Jonathan often accused her of cheating, which eventually led to their breakup. However, he seemed to hold a grudge against her and would use any chance to hurt her feelings. The situation was further complicated because they attended the same class. The police verified Kendall's alibi, which checked out. Despite this, they kept him on the list of suspects and decided to scrutinize some of his statements further. The next person the detectives investigated was Bridget's ex-boyfriend, Jonathan. Several witnesses from Bridget's close circle had mentioned him during their interviews. When the police attempted to contact Jonathan, they couldn't reach him. They decided to visit his home, but upon arrival, they found the house empty, with signs suggesting it had been abandoned in a hurry. This discovery raised serious concerns. The back wall of the family home was covered with round holes resembling bullet holes. Based on the number of holes, investigators concluded that the bullet holes were either from a semi-automatic weapon or the attacker has been deliberately impacting the front of the house for a long time. During their investigation, they discovered that about a week before Bridget's murder, Jonathan had been targeted by 3 unknown individuals in a car. They had opened attack on him, but he managed to hide in his room, avoiding injury. Following the attack, Jonathan reported the incident to the police. Despite the investigators' best efforts, the case remained unsolved. The only evidence collected at the scene were spent cartridges and several bullets. Neighbors revealed that Jonathan moved out the day after the attack, fearing for his safety. The police suspected that these events might be connected. On March 14, the active phase of the search for Jonathan began. He became the main suspect in this case. By that time, detectives had already managed to visit the school where he studied. Bridget also studied there. The administration reported that Jonathan had not been in class in recent days. Investigators decided to talk to other students from his class. Police officers tried to find out where Jonathan went after the attack. Detectives met Alexander Olivieri, who introduced himself as a close friend of Bridget. According to him, they had recently met, and since then, they often communicated. Alexander immediately said that during her relationship with Jonathan, Bridget repeatedly feared for her life and health, as Jonathan behaved aggressively. Even after their breakup, Jonathan continued to pursue her. They often saw each other at school, and Jonathan did not miss the opportunity to offend her. All this often ended in quarrels and confrontations. Bridget just wanted to forget about the relationship and the unpleasant breakup, but her ex-boyfriend prevented this with all his might. According to Alexander, Jonathan was capable of causing harm to Bridget. Investigators tried to find out where Alexander was on the night of Bridget's murder. According to him, he was supposed to meet her that very night. They were going to pick up her boyfriend, Zach Richards, from the bus station. Zach was returning from visiting relatives who lived in a neighboring state. Alexander claimed that he arrived late to Bridget's house with another friend named Alan Perez. Bridget had promised to wait for them near the house, but he did not see her anywhere. She ignored their calls, so they left, assuming she had either already gone to bed. They met Zach and drove around the city for several hours before returning home at around 5:00 a.m. According to the forensic expert, by that time, Bridget had already been killed. Alexander learned of Bridget's death from the news. Detectives then questioned Alan, who told a similar story. However, his version slightly differed. He claimed that after meeting Zach, they played computer games all night and did not drive around the city. These discrepancies raised suspicions. Detectives added Alexander and Alan to the list of suspects, as their stories did not align and no one could confirm their alibis. Nevertheless, Jonathan remained the main witness investigators wanted to question. Detectives quickly discovered that Jonathan's mother had not left the city after the attack on their home. Instead, she had moved in with a family friend for a while her son was sent to relatives in Austin, Texas. Law enforcement officers quickly found Jonathan's mother, who admitted that her son often got into trouble because of his bad character. She confirmed that the attack on the house was clearly directed against him, as the bullets were aimed at the side of the house where his room was. According to her, Jonathan had gotten into a fight before the attack, so the attackers were most likely connected to this incident. Unfortunately, it was not possible to prove this during the investigation. The relationship between Jonathan and his mother was far from ideal. Despite sending him to Austin, she did not keep in touch with him and did not know his exact whereabouts. However, she provided the police with an address to help them begin their search for Jonathan. Help for the investigation came from an unexpected source. Alan's lawyer approached the police and stated that his client had important information regarding the case. Alan was willing to provide this information in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Detectives considered the information potentially useful and agreed to the terms. According to Alan, there was a direct connection between Bridget's murder and the drive-by attack at Jonathan's house. Alan revealed that both he and Alexander had joined the National Guard. where they learned how to handle weapons. After mastering basic skills, Alexander continued his education at school and met Bridget. Bridget confided in Alexander about her problems with her ex-boyfriend Jonathan. Together, they came up with a solution. According to Alan, in the incident that happened at Jonathan's house, it was Bridget who directly acted. Alex used his semi-automatic weapon, while Alan was also present in the car but only as an observer. Unfortunately for the entire group, Bridget started talking too much, putting everyone at risk of being exposed. On April 2, 2011, Alexander planned to meet Bridget to confront her about how her loose talk had nearly jeopardized them all. Considering his training in the National Guard and aspirations for a career in the military, Alexander feared Bridget's behavior could ruin his future. Meanwhile, Jonathan had already reported the situation to the police, and an active investigation was underway. Before that, after completing his training, Alexander began carrying a 9mm Beretta in a holster under his clothes. That evening, Alexander and Alan went to pick up Bridget from her house. They convinced her to get into the car by pretending they will to pick up her boyfriend Zach from the bus station. Initially, Bridget refused to go, so Alexander followed her into the house, determined to get her into the car by any necessary. While this was happening, Alan hid in the back seat of the Chevrolet Suburban under a large blanket. Eventually, Alexander managed to persuade Bridget to get into the car. They drove to an isolated area. On the way, Alexander started to put pressure on Bridget and accused her of the fact that her chatter could cost them all dearly. Upon arriving at the secluded location, they walked to a nearby wooded area. Alexander brought a shovel and flashlight and, together with Bridget, entered the forest. After some time, Alan got out of the car and quietly followed them, staying far enough behind to avoid being seen by Bridget. According to Alan, Alexander forced Bridget to dig, intimidating her and insisting it was urgent. While they were digging, Alexander suddenly pulled out a weapon and aimed it at the back of Bridget's head. Alan initially thought Alexander was trying to scare Bridget as a way of teaching her a lesson, but to his shock, Alexander pulled the trigger, killing her instantly. After the murder, Alexander hurried back to the car, taking the shovel and flashlight with him. He destroyed Bridget's phone and discarded the weapon, likely somewhere in the forest. Alan was stunned and confronted Alexander, angrily accusing him of what he had done. However, Alexander threatened Alan, warning him to stay silent or face consequences. Alexander then took all the items involved in the murder back to his home. Later, around 4:00 a.m., they picked up Bridget's boyfriend, Zach, from the bus station as originally planned. That night, Alexander invited a third friend to spend the night at his place. The following day, Alexander convinced Alan to work together to create a shared alibi. They agreed to stick to their story when speaking with the police. Alexander believed this plan would deceive the detectives. To further mislead the investigation, he decided to shift suspicion onto Bridget's argumentative ex-boyfriend, Jonathan. Alan admitted that he and Alexander had willingly participated in an attack at Jonathan's house to help Bridget. However, Alexander hadn't anticipated that Bridget would be telling others about the incident. According to Alan's confession, Alexander saw no other solution than to kill Bridget to protect his future. Later, investigators questioned Zach, Bridget's boyfriend. Zach confessed that he had known about the attack at Jonathan's house. He also confirmed that Bridget had started sharing the story with others. Bridget had even considered posting about it on social media to intimidate Jonathan, which enraged Alexander. He repeatedly begged Bridget to drop these plans, but she refused to listen. On the evening of the meeting, Zach knew Bridget was supposed to arrive with two friends, but when the car arrived, she wasn't in it. When asked about Bridget's whereabouts, Alexander said he couldn't reach her. A few days later, Zach learned of Bridget's death. Alexander Olivieri was immediately arrested, and during a search of his home, police were unable to find the weapon believed to have been used in the car attack, as well as the weapon used to kill Bridget. However, they did find instructions for a weapon model that matched the shell casings discovered at the crime scene. Investigators also recovered a shovel that Bridget had used to dig a hole in the forest before being shot. Her DNA was confirmed to be on it. A thorough inspection of Alexander's car revealed numerous fabric fibers. However, Alexander never admitted to his actions. Instead, he attempted to shift the blame onto Allen. At this time, the prosecutor's office presented strong evidence disproving his claims. During the investigation, video recordings from 2010 were uncovered, showing Alexander demonstrating his use weapon skills with the same type of weapon used to kill Bridget and in the attack at Jonathan's house. FBI agents took an active part in the investigation. A few days before the trial, they presented the results of fiber analysis conducted on materials collected from Alexander's car. The fibers matched the artificial fur on the victim's clothing. Bridget had been wearing a bright and distinctive outfit, making it easy to trace the source of the fibers. Additional evidence has strengthened the case against Alexander. Alexander's lawyer advised him to remain composed during the trial. He chose not to testify and never confessed to the murder. His cold demeanor made him appear calculating and unfeeling. On August 1, 2012, Alexander was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Bridget's father deemed the sentence fair and expressed hope that Alexander would never be released. As promised by the police, Allen was not prosecuted for any of the incidents described. There are places where nothing seems to happen, not because nothing does, but because no one is looking closely enough. In the middle of the New Mexico desert sits a quiet town called Truth or Consequences, a place so still and ordinary that even silence feels normal. People come and go, time drifts, and when someone disappears, it doesn't always raise alarms. In 1999, a woman vanished. No immediate search, no urgency, just another absence slipping quietly through the cracks. Until one day, she came back. Running, injured, terrified, emerging from somewhere no one even knew existed. But what she escaped wasn't just a crime scene, it was something built, something planned, something hidden in plain sight. And the moment she spoke, everything began to unravel. Because the real question was never what happened to her, it was how many others never made it out. The town does not announce danger. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, sits low against the desert horizon. Sparse streets. Faded signage. A place where time stretches and sound travels farther than it should. According to regional records, the population barely crossed a few thousand in the late 1990s. It was not the kind of place where crimes echoed loudly. Most things passed quietly. That was part of the problem. In July 1999, a woman named Cynthia Vigil would later describe being held against her will inside a trailer on the outskirts of this town. At that moment, no one outside knew. No calls were made. No alarms were raised. The desert absorbed everything. She had last been seen alive in Albuquerque. That is a fact confirmed through investigative records. What happened between that sighting and her arrival in Truth or Consequences was, at first, fragmented. According to her later testimony, she was abducted, restrained, and transported across state lines. But at the time, she was simply gone. The atmosphere around her disappearance carried no urgency. Not immediately. Missing adults, especially those living on the margins, often did not trigger large-scale searches. That pattern appears repeatedly in law enforcement archives from the period. It created gaps. And gaps allowed time. Inside the trailer, time worked differently. Investigators would later document that the location sat isolated, partially obscured, and structurally unremarkable. No outward signs of violence. No noise complaints filed. Nothing to suggest what was happening inside. This detail would become critical later, the crimes did not rely on secrecy alone, they relied on invisibility. What kind of place allows something like this to exist unnoticed? Cynthia Vigil would eventually answer that question herself, but not yet. At this stage, she was still inside. Still enduring. Still part of a story no one had begun to tell. And then, something changed. Not in the town. Not in the system. In her. The break did not come from outside, it came from within the room. On March 22, 1999, according to police records, Cynthia Vigil managed to escape from the trailer where she had been held. The details she later gave were consistent, physical, and immediate. Bruises. Restraint marks. Signs of prolonged assault documented by medical personnel. These were not abstract claims, they were visible, measurable, and urgent. She ran naked through the desert. That is not interpretation. That is fact, supported by witness accounts and responding officers. She reached a nearby residence and asked for help. The people inside called authorities. Within minutes, the silence that had surrounded the trailer began to fracture. What kind of fear drives someone to run into open land with nothing? When deputies arrived, Vigil told them she had been held captive for days. She described chains. A bed fitted with restraints. Recorded audio played to her, detailing acts that had not yet happened. According to her testimony, the voice was calm. Controlled. Instructional. That detail would later become one of the most disturbing elements in the case. Because it suggested planning. Not impulse. Not escalation. Design. Inside her account, investigators found structure. She described a system: abduction, confinement, assault, release, or something worse. At that stage, law enforcement did not yet know how far the pattern extended. But they knew enough to act quickly. They followed her back to the trailer. The location matched her description. Remote. Quiet. Ordinary on the outside. But inside, according to search records, officers encountered items that aligned with her statement: restraints, tools, and an environment that appeared deliberately constructed. Nothing chaotic. Everything placed with purpose. One fact became immediately clear: this was not a first-time crime scene. The emotional atmosphere shifted rapidly. What began as a single survivor's report now suggested the possibility of multiple victims. Investigators had to consider a question that would shape everything that followed. If she escaped, how many others had not? Cynthia Vigil's survival changed the direction of the case. Without her, the trailer might have remained just another structure in the desert. With her, it became evidence. And evidence leads to people. The name connected to that trailer would soon emerge, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. David Parker Ray. The name did not arrive with shock. It arrived with recognition. David Parker Ray was not a stranger to truth or consequences. According to local records and investigative reporting, he had lived in the area for years. He worked as a mechanic for the New Mexico State Parks Department. He owned property. He spoke to neighbors. He blended into the slow rhythm of the town. There was no immediate reason to suspect him. That is what made the next step difficult. When law enforcement connected the trailer to Ray, they were not approaching an unknown figure, they were approaching someone who had existed in plain sight. A man described by some as quiet, by others as reserved. No clear history of violent crime that would predict what investigators were beginning to uncover. How does someone build something so controlled, without being seen? According to investigative files, Ray lived a largely compartmentalized life. He had relationships, including with a woman named Cindy Hendy. She would later become a central figure in the case. But at this stage, she was simply part of his environment, another name, another connection. Nothing overtly alarming. Not yet. But patterns began to form. Witnesses, interviewed after Vigil's escape, described Ray as someone who preferred isolation. His property sat in a location that allowed distance from neighbors. The trailer itself was not unusual in structure, but its placement offered privacy. That detail would later become critical in understanding how his activities remained concealed. Inside law enforcement briefings, the tone shifted from reactive to investigative. They began building a profile, not psychological speculation, but behavioral mapping. Routine. Access. Opportunity. Ray had tools. He had space. He had time. According to case records, he also had knowledge of mechanical systems and construction, skills that could be applied beyond his official work. Then came the evidence already collected from the trailer. Items found inside did not suggest spontaneity. They suggested repetition. Preparation. A system that had been refined over time. Investigators were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. They were asking how long it had been happening. And whether Ray had done it alone. Cynthia Vigil's testimony placed him directly at the center. She identified him. Described his voice. His behavior. His methods. Her account aligned with the physical evidence recovered. That alignment gave investigators something crucial: corroboration. But there was still a gap. No confirmed timeline. No known number of victims. No clear beginning. Only a man who had lived quietly in a quiet town, and a trailer that suggested something far more deliberate than anyone had imagined. The investigation was no longer about one escape. It was about uncovering a pattern that may have existed for years. And inside that pattern, something waited to be fully revealed. The structure did not resist discovery. It revealed itself. When investigators entered the trailer linked to David Parker Ray, they were not stepping into a chaotic crime scene. According to official search records and later court testimony, what they found was organized, deliberate in layout, specific in function. The space had a purpose, and that purpose unfolded piece by piece. At the center was a bed. Not an ordinary one. It was modified. Equipped with restraints. Chains positioned with mechanical precision. Nearby, tools were arranged, not scattered, not improvised, but placed in a way that suggested repeated use. This detail became critical in the investigation. Nothing indicated a single, isolated event. Everything suggested a system. What kind of mind constructs a place like this over time? Among the most significant pieces of evidence recovered were audio recordings, cassette tapes. According to investigators, one of these tapes contained a pre-recorded message, spoken in a calm, controlled tone. The voice, identified as Ray's, described procedures. Not in anger. Not in chaos. But with clarity. The tape outlined what victims would experience. It explained restraints. It referenced prior victims, though without names. It suggested that what was happening had happened before. According to law enforcement, this recording became one of the most disturbing elements of the case, not because of what it said alone, but because of how it said it. Measured. Methodical. Planned. Forensic teams processed the trailer thoroughly. Fibers, biological traces, fingerprints. Some evidence supported Cynthia Vigil's account directly. Other elements hinted at additional individuals, though not all could be conclusively identified. That uncertainty created tension inside the investigation. Evidence pointed outward, but not always clearly. No confirmed bodies were found at the site. That fact would shape everything that followed. Because it introduced a problem. How do you prove the full extent of a pattern without physical remains? Still, the trailer itself became a form of testimony. It showed preparation, control, repetition. It demonstrated that whatever had occurred inside was not accidental and not brief. It had been built. And anything built over time leaves traces, not just of actions, but of intention. Investigators began expanding their scope. They were no longer looking only at the trailer. They were looking beyond it, into records, missing persons cases, and the people connected to Ray. Because a system like this rarely exists in isolation. And sometimes, the structure is only the beginning. The story did not remain centered on one man. It began to widen. As investigators dug deeper into David Parker Ray's life, another name moved from the background into focus: Cindy Hendy. According to court records and police interviews, she was not a distant acquaintance. She was present. Close enough to be inside the same spaces. Close enough to witness what others never saw. And, according to testimony, close enough to participate. Hendy was arrested shortly after Cynthia Vigil's escape. Under questioning, her statements would shift. At times, she minimized her role. At others, she acknowledged involvement in certain acts. Investigators faced a familiar challenge: how much was truth, and how much was protection? What does complicity look like when it lives beside silence? According to the investigation file, Hendy admitted to being present during Vigil's captivity. She described elements of the trailer that matched what law enforcement had already documented. That alignment strengthened the case, but it also introduced a deeper concern. If one person knew, could others have known too? The inquiry expanded beyond Hendy. Detectives examined Ray's social circle, his past relationships, and any individuals who may have had access to the property. Among those mentioned in investigative threads was Ray's daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray. She was later charged in connection with a separate abduction case involving a woman named Kelly Garrett in 1996. Garrett survived, and her testimony added another layer, suggesting that the pattern extended back years before Vigil's escape. That timeline mattered, because it indicated repetition across multiple incidents, involving more than one person. Still, the evidence remained uneven. Some accounts overlapped. Others conflicted. Certain claims could not be fully verified. Investigators had to separate what was provable from what was possible. And in doing so, they confronted a difficult reality: networks of harm are rarely clean or fully visible. They are fragmented, hidden inside relationships, protected by doubt. Plea negotiations began to emerge as a strategic necessity. According to court proceedings, Hendy eventually entered a plea agreement, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. It was not a resolution, it was a trade. Information for time. But even with cooperation, gaps remained. No complete list of victims. No confirmed number. Only fragments, statements, evidence, patterns. The case was no longer about a single location or a single act. It had become something broader. A system, possibly involving multiple people, operating over an unknown period, partially revealed, but not fully understood. And somewhere within that system, there were still missing pieces. Pieces that may never be recovered. The evidence pointed outward. But it did not always land. As investigators expanded beyond the trailer and the known survivors, a pattern began to surface, one built not only on what was found, but on what was missing. According to law enforcement records and later investigative reporting, multiple unsolved disappearances in New Mexico and surrounding states were reviewed for possible connections to David Parker Ray. Women who vanished. Cases that had gone quiet. Files that had never been closed, but never resolved. One name frequently examined was that of Marie Parker, who disappeared in 1997 after last being seen in Albuquerque. Another was Stephanie Wilson, who vanished under similarly unclear circumstances. These cases, among others, were revisited. Timelines compared. locations mapped. But despite circumstantial overlaps, no direct forensic evidence conclusively linked Ray to these disappearances. That distinction mattered. Because suspicion is not proof. How many stories remain suspended between possibility and certainty? Investigators also reviewed Ray's own statements. According to interrogation transcripts referenced in case summaries, he made claims about multiple victims, numbers that ranged widely, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes inconsistent. At one point, he allegedly suggested involvement in dozens of deaths. But those claims were never substantiated with physical evidence. No bodies were recovered. No confirmed burial sites identified. Searches were conducted. Land surrounding his property was examined. Reservoirs, desert areas, and remote locations were considered. But each search ended the same way, with absence. And absence complicates justice. Without remains, without DNA confirmation, without a definitive chain linking a victim to a suspect, cases remain open, but unresolved. For families, that creates a different kind of grief. One without closure. One without answers. Still, the pattern could not be ignored. Ray had the means. The space. The documented behavior. Survivors who described a system that implied repetition. Investigators were left balancing two realities, what they could prove, and what they strongly suspected. The emotional weight of that divide was significant. Because every unproven case carries a question. Not just what happened, but whether it will ever be known. In the absence of certainty, the investigation moved forward with what it had. Prosecutors focused on charges that could be supported. Survivors whose stories aligned with evidence. Crimes that could stand in court. But beneath that strategy, something remained unresolved. A possibility that extended beyond the limits of proof, and that possibility would follow the case into the courtroom. The courtroom did not hold all the answers. It held what could be proven. By the early 2000s, David Parker Ray faced multiple charges tied to kidnapping, sexual assault, and torture. According to court records, the prosecution's case relied heavily on survivor testimony, especially that of Cynthia Vigil, alongside the physical evidence recovered from the trailer. The structure of the case was clear: establish a pattern, demonstrate control, and anchor it in verifiable acts. But there was a limit. No murder charges were filed. Not because investigators did not suspect more, but because they could not prove it beyond reasonable doubt. Without bodies, without definitive forensic links to deaths, the legal system narrowed its focus to crimes it could substantiate. That decision shaped the entire trial. What does justice look like when parts of the story cannot be told in court? Ray ultimately entered into a plea agreement in 2001. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including kidnapping and torture. In exchange, the possibility of the death penalty was removed. He received a sentence of 224 years in prison. On paper, it was a definitive outcome. A man removed from society for the remainder of his life. But even that outcome carried an unfinished edge. Because the broader questions, the suspected victims, the missing women, the scale of the alleged crimes, remained outside the verdict. The courtroom addressed what it could confirm. It did not resolve what it could not. Cindy Hendy, his accomplice, also faced trial. She accepted a plea deal, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. Her role, while established, was also bounded by what could be proven. Again, fragments. Again, limitations. Then, in May 2002, something unexpected occurred. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison. The timing mattered. His death closed off any possibility of further testimony, further interrogation, further clarification. Whatever he knew about alleged victims, about locations, about the full extent of his actions, remained with him. Silence, once again, became part of the case. For investigators and families, that silence was not neutral. It was obstructive. It froze the narrative in place, partially solved, partially obscured. The trial had delivered a sentence, but not closure. And without closure, the case did not end in the courtroom. It lingered. In files. In memories. In unanswered questions. The case did not end with a verdict. It settled into something quieter. After David Parker Ray's death in 2002, the investigation effectively lost its central source of answers. According to law enforcement summaries, no further major breakthroughs followed. The physical evidence had been processed. The testimonies recorded. The legal outcomes finalized. What remained was not an active pursuit, but an enduring uncertainty. Because the scale was never fully measured. How do you understand a crime when its boundaries are unknown? For the survivors, the aftermath was not defined by the courtroom alone. Cynthia Vigil's testimony had been pivotal, but survival carries its own weight. Public records and interviews indicate long-term psychological impact, trauma that does not resolve with sentencing. The same applied to other victims who came forward. Their experiences became part of the official narrative, but also part of a private, ongoing recovery. The community of truth or consequences absorbed the case in a different way. A town that had once seemed distant from major crime found itself tied to one of the most unsettling investigations in modern American criminal history. According to regional reporting, there was no single moment of collective closure. Instead, there was a gradual shift, an awareness that something had existed unnoticed for years. That awareness changed perception. Not just of one man, but of proximity itself. Law enforcement agencies also reflected on the investigation. The case highlighted systemic gaps, particularly in how missing persons cases were prioritized. Many of the potential victims linked to Ray had lived on the margins of society. Their disappearances did not always trigger immediate, large-scale responses. This pattern, documented in multiple reports, raised broader questions about whose cases receive urgency, and whose do not. That is one of the lasting lessons. Because invisibility is not accidental. It is often structured. Despite extensive efforts, no confirmed list of additional victims has ever been established. The allegations, the suspicions, the unverified claims, they remain part of the case, but outside definitive proof. Investigators have acknowledged this limitation publicly. It is not a failure of effort, but a boundary of evidence. And so the story remains partially open. Not in the sense of an active investigation, but in the sense of an incomplete understanding. David Parker Ray was convicted. His crimes, as proven, were severe and systematic. But the full extent of what may have occurred remains uncertain, held between testimony, evidence, and absence. The case leaves behind a quiet, persistent question. Not just about what happened, but about what was never found. And whether, in some cases, truth can exist, without ever being fully seen. However, something has changed. When the boy doesn't return home and time passes without a word, his absence is the first sign that something is wrong. When he was found, the scene indicated a planned, barbaric act of violence. It was hard to imagine such a terrible thing could have happened to a young boy. For over a year, these details remained a mystery, with no suspect in the case stalled. It was just an incomplete pattern waiting to be understood. Meanwhile, the person responsible continued to live a normal life, far from the scene of the crime, blending in and going unnoticed. Then, the same pattern emerged again, and this time, it would be recognized. Portland, Maine, August 22, 1982. The day began without warning. 11-year-old Richard "Ricky" Stetson left his home to go jogging along the Back Cove Trail, a 3.5-mile path familiar to locals, open, visible, and considered safe. It was the kind of place where danger did not announce itself, where a child could run alone, and no one would question it. Ricky never returned. As daylight faded, concern turned urgent. His parents called the police. Officers began canvassing the trail, retracing what should have been a simple loop. There were no immediate signs of struggle. No witnesses who could place a moment of violence. Only a gap, a stretch of time where Ricky had simply disappeared. The next day, the search ended. A motorist traveling along Interstate 295 spotted something on the roadside. It was Ricky's body. The discovery shifted the case instantly from missing person to homicide. And not a random act, something far more deliberate. According to investigative findings, the attacker had attempted to undress the boy. There were signs of control, of escalation. Ricky had been stabbed, strangled, and most disturbingly, bitten. The bite mark would later become one of the most critical forensic clues, a detail that suggested proximity, intensity, and a level of personal violence that investigators could not ignore. Police moved quickly. A suspect was identified and arrested. For a moment, it seemed the case might resolve itself early. But forensic analysis told a different story. The bite marks on Ricky's body did not match the suspect's teeth. The evidence failed. After approximately a year and a half in custody, the suspect was released. The case collapsed. No new leads emerged. No additional suspects surfaced. The brutality of the crime stood in contrast to the silence that followed. Investigators were left with fragments, method, injury patterns, a forensic anomaly, but no one to attach them to. And so the case went cold. What no one could yet see was that the violence in Portland was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a pattern, one that would remain hidden, waiting, until it resurfaced more than a year later in a different state, under different circumstances, but with the same quiet precision. A line had been drawn. It just hadn't been connected yet. For nearly a year and a half after Ricky Stetson's murder, the trail went quiet. Portland investigators had exhausted what they could. The crime scene had yielded fragments, the pattern of injuries, the bite mark, the attempted undressing, all pointing to a controlled and deeply personal act of violence. But without a match, without a name, those details remained suspended in isolation. And with that, the investigation lost momentum. According to available case records, no additional viable leads emerged after that point. The file did not close, but it stopped moving. Detectives revisited evidence, re-examined statements, but nothing advanced the case forward. The killer had left behind a signature, but not an identity. Beyond Maine, life continued. Somewhere else, the man responsible for Ricky's death was still living within the structure of ordinary society. There were no alerts crossing state lines. No centralized system linking violent crimes with behavioral similarities. In the early 1980s, investigative communication between jurisdictions remained limited, often fragmented. A crime in Maine stayed in Maine, unless something unmistakable connected it outward. Nothing did. Not yet. During this period, John Joubert was moving through his own life. By late 1983, he would be stationed in Nebraska as a radar technician in the United States Air Force, living in Bellevue. At the time, there was no reason to connect him to Portland. No reason to suspect that the violence seen along Back Cove had followed him across state lines. The gap between 1982 and 1983 would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because it suggested control. The absence of known crimes did not necessarily mean the absence of intent. It raised questions investigators would only ask later. Had the killer stopped, or simply waited? Was the first murder an isolated act, or the beginning of something rehearsed, refined, and postponed? There were no answers yet. Only distance, time, and a false sense that whatever had happened in Portland had ended there. It hadn't. More than a year later, in a quiet suburb hundreds of miles away, the pattern would return, not as a coincidence, but as a continuation. And this time, it would not remain hidden for long. On September 18, 1983, more than a year after the murder of Ricky Stetson, violence erupted again in Bellevue, Nebraska, but no one realized it at the time. 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly stepped out early that morning to deliver newspapers along his regular route. It was routine work. Predictable. The kind of responsibility is entrusted to a teenager in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He followed the same path he always did. Then, somewhere between deliveries, the routine broke. When Danny failed to return home, concern began to build. His family retraced his route. Neighbors were asked. The area was checked. And then, a critical detail emerged. Danny's bicycle was found abandoned near one of his delivery stops. It was not hidden. Not damaged. Just left behind, as if the moment had been interrupted. According to investigation records, there were no clear signs of a struggle at the scene. No immediate witnesses who could explain what had happened in that narrow window of time. The disappearance was clean, controlled. Police responded quickly. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, gathering fragments of memory. But the morning had been quiet. Too quiet. Nothing stood out. Search teams expanded outward. Fields. Roadsides. Wooded areas. Each hour without answers deepened the urgency. 3 days later, the search ended. Danny's body was discovered in a remote area outside Bellevue. The condition of the body immediately shifted the case from abduction to something far more disturbing. According to publicly available investigative findings, the victim had been bound and subjected to multiple stab wounds. There were indications of control, deliberate actions that suggested the attacker had taken time, not acted in panic. The violence was structured. Investigators began building a profile. The offender had approached without drawing attention. Had gained compliance quickly. Had removed the victim from a public area without witnesses. And then carried out the attack in isolation. It pointed to someone organized. Someone who understood timing, visibility, and risk. At this stage, the case was treated as a local homicide. There was no confirmed link to Portland, Maine. No shared suspect. No cross-state coordination that would tie Danny Eberly's death to Ricky Stetson's murder. But the similarities were there, waiting. A young boy. Alone. Approached in a routine setting. Controlled. Moved. Killed with a mix of restraint and escalation. The pattern had not changed. Only the location. And as investigators worked to understand what had happened to Danny, they had no way of knowing that this was not the end of the violence in Nebraska, but the beginning of a sequence that would soon make the invisible unmistakable. Papillion, Nebraska. On December 2, 1983, winter had settled over the suburbs. The air was colder now. Streets quieter. Daylight shorter. But routine remained, and routine, once again, would be exploited. 12-year-old Christopher Walden left his home that day and never made it back. At first, the disappearance felt familiar in a way no one wanted to admit. A boy is gone. No immediate witnesses. No clear explanation. But this time, something was different. The memory of Danny Eberly was still fresh. When Christopher failed to return, the response was faster. Sharper. Families in the area had already begun to sense that something was wrong in their community. Parents were more alert. Police moved with greater urgency, Search teams were deployed almost immediately. Within 2 days, the worst was confirmed. Christopher's body was found in a rural area not far from where he had last been seen. The condition of the scene and the injuries inflicted revealed details that investigators could not ignore. According to investigative findings, the victim had been bound. There were stab wounds. The pattern, once again, suggested control. A sequence. A method. Now there were 2. In Nebraska, 2 boys. The same age. Both were abducted in ordinary moments. Both were quickly taken away from public places. Both were later found in remote locations. Both were subjected to deliberate violence. The probability of coincidence collapsed. Investigators began formally considering what had been only a possibility weeks earlier. They were dealing with a serial offender. The pressure intensified. Task forces expanded. Patrols increased. Residents were warned. Parents kept children inside. Schools became cautious environments. The sense of safety that once defined Bellevue and its surrounding areas began to erode. But the most critical shift happened inside the investigation itself. Detectives started to look not just for evidence, but for patterns of behavior. Someone who moved through the community unnoticed. Someone who could approach children without raising alarm. Someone patient. Someone local. At the same time, questions began to surface that reached beyond Nebraska. The similarities between the 2 cases were too strong to dismiss. And for some investigators, there was a growing, unspoken concern. If this offender had done it twice here, had he done it before somewhere else? The answer existed. But it had not yet been connected. Somewhere within the same quiet neighborhoods now gripped by fear, the man responsible was still living his daily life. Observing. Waiting. Blending in. And as the investigation widened, it was not a major breakthrough that would change everything, but something smaller. By early January 1984, the investigation had reached a critical point. No suspect had been named. And yet, the pattern was undeniable. Police began narrowing their focus, not on strangers passing through, but on individuals embedded within the community. The offender, by all indications, was someone who understood the environment, someone who could move without attracting attention. Someone ordinary. That shift changed everything. Investigators started re-examining small details. Reports that had seemed insignificant. Observations that did not initially fit. Among them, one stood out. A neighbor had noticed a man. He was quiet. Reserved. He lived nearby. Nothing overtly suspicious, but there was something off in his behavior. Subtle inconsistencies. The kind that are easy to ignore until context gives them weight. The man was identified as John Joubert. At the time, Joubert was serving in the United States Air Force, stationed at Offutt Air Force Base. He worked as a radar technician. His life, on the surface, was structured and disciplined. He lived alone. Kept to himself. No criminal record that immediately raised an alarm. But as investigators looked closer, small details began to accumulate. According to investigative records, Joubert had been seen in areas near where Christopher Walden disappeared. His routines placed him within proximity of key locations, not constantly, not obviously, but enough to matter. Surveillance began. Officers observed his movements, his habits, his interactions, or lack of them. What they saw was not overtly incriminating, but it was consistent with the emerging profile, controlled, solitary, methodical. Then came a critical moment. On January 11, 1984, Joubert was stopped by police under circumstances that, at first glance, seemed minor. A routine interaction. But during that stop, officers noted items and behavior that did not align cleanly with his explanation of events. It was enough. The following day, January 12, 1984, Jean Joubert was taken into custody. What followed was the turning point investigators had been waiting for. Inside Joubert's possession, and through subsequent searches, authorities began uncovering elements that aligned with the crimes. Materials, writings, indicators of violent fantasy and control. Nothing singularly definitive at first, but together, they formed a pattern. A pattern that matched the crimes. For the first time since August 1982, the investigation had a name. A face. A focal point. But even then, the full scope of what Joubert had done was not yet clear. Because as investigators began to question him, they would uncover something far more disturbing than 2 murders in Nebraska. They would uncover a past that reached beyond state lines, back to a case that had long gone cold. And with it, the realization that the pattern had never started in Nebraska, it had only surfaced there. The arrest itself was quiet. There were no sirens. No public confrontation. Jean Joubert was taken into custody with the same controlled restraint that had defined the investigation leading up to that moment. To an outside observer, it might have seemed routine, another man questioned, another lead being pursued. But inside the interrogation room, the direction of the case began to shift. At first, Joubert did not present as overtly unstable. He was composed, soft-spoken. His demeanor aligned with the life he appeared to lead, a disciplined Air Force radar technician, structured, precise, and outwardly unremarkable. But as questioning progressed, inconsistencies began to surface. According to investigative records, Joubert's statements did not fully align with known timelines. There were gaps, subtle contradictions, details that seemed rehearsed, but not entirely consistent under pressure. Investigators pressed carefully, aware that they were close, but not yet certain. Authorities executed warrants tied to Joubert's residence and personal belongings. What they found did not immediately resolve the case, but it deepened suspicion. There were items that suggested fixation, materials linked to violent fantasy, control, and domination. Notes and writings that, while not direct confessions, reflected an internal world far removed from his outward persona. It was no longer just circumstantial proximity. It was behavioral alignment. At the same time, physical evidence began to take shape. Fibers, tools, and environmental traces were examined against the known crime scenes. Each element on its own was limited, but together, they formed a growing structure, one that increasingly pointed back to Joubert. Under continued interrogation, the pressure mounted. And then, the break came, and Joubert began to talk. He admitted to the killings of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden. The details he provided, locations, methods, sequence, aligned with the evidence investigators had already gathered. It was not a vague admission. It was specific, controlled, almost clinical. But the most significant moment came next. He spoke of another victim. A boy in Maine. Richard "Ricky" Stetson. With that statement, a case that had remained unresolved for over a year suddenly reconnected. The geographic gap collapsed. The pattern was no longer theoretical, it was confirmed. One offender. Multiple states. Multiple victims. The investigation had moved from suspicion to certainty. But as Joubert's confessions continued, investigators began to understand something more unsettling than the crimes themselves, the structure behind them. And to fully understand it, they would have to look beyond what Joubert had done, and into why. After Jean Joubert started confessing, the investigation changed from piecing together what happened to understanding why it happened. They were organized, intentional, and profoundly disturbing. According to interrogation records and later psychological evaluations, Joubert described urges that had developed long before the murders in Nebraska. These were not sudden impulses. They were persistent thoughts, shaped over time, centered on control, domination, and violent fantasy. The acts themselves, as he explained, were not random expressions of anger. They were, in his own words, something he felt compelled to carry out. Investigators noted the precision in how he spoke. There was little visible emotion. No outward panic. Joubert described his actions with a level of detachment that suggested distance, as if recounting a sequence rather than confronting the weight of it. He explained how he approached his victims, how he gained control, and how he transported them. Each step followed a pattern. Control was central. The bindings. The isolation of the locations. The escalation of violence. These were not incidental details, they were part of a process. According to case records, Joubert admitted to deriving a sense of power from the acts, particularly in moments where the victim's autonomy was completely removed. The bite marks, first seen in the murder of Ricky Stetson, also took on new meaning. They were not accidental. They were part of the ritual, a physical imprint, an assertion of dominance that investigators later understood as deeply symbolic within Joubert's psychological framework. His writings reinforced this. Materials recovered from his possession revealed violent fantasies that mirrored aspects of the crimes. Themes of control, submission, and repetition appeared consistently. These were not isolated thoughts. They were rehearsals. Yet, outside of this internal world, Joubert maintained a different identity. He thrived in organized settings like the military, where routine and discipline were key. To others, he seemed quiet and reserved. Nothing obviously indicated he was capable of the crimes he committed. This contrast, the difference between his normal appearance and his hidden, driving urges, was one of the most unsettling parts of the case. Psychological experts later examined whether Joubert met the criteria for specific disorders. While interpretations varied, there was general agreement that his behavior aligned with patterns seen in organized offenders, individuals capable of planning, controlling, and repeating acts while maintaining a stable external life. But even with analysis, one element remained difficult to quantify. Why did he stop, and then start again? The gap between Maine and Nebraska suggested restraint. The return suggested inevitability. For investigators, the confessions provided answers. But they also exposed limits, the recognition that understanding motive does not always lead to understanding origin. What remained was a clear sequence of actions, a confirmed pattern, and a man who had carried it out with intention. The courtroom became the final place where the pattern would be laid out, not as fragments, but as a complete sequence. John Joubert stood trial in Nebraska for the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden. By this stage, the investigation had already established a strong foundation, his confessions, corroborated by physical evidence, and supported by the consistency of his own statements. The strategy of the defense did not center on denying the acts. Instead, it turned toward his state of mind. Attorneys argued that Joubert suffered from mental illness, that his actions were the result of psychological disturbance rather than calculated intent. It was an effort to shift the case away from premeditated murder and toward diminished responsibility, a critical distinction in determining sentencing. But the prosecution presented a different narrative. They emphasized planning, control, sequence. Joubert had selected victims in routine settings, approached without drawing attention, removed them efficiently, transported them, bound them, killed them in isolated locations. These were not the actions of someone acting in confusion or panic. They were structured, deliberate. The jury was asked to consider not just what Joubert had done, but how he had done it. In the end, they found him guilty. Joubert was sentenced to death. In a separate legal process, Joubert also confessed to the 1982 murder of Ricky Stetson in Maine, formally closing a case that had remained unresolved for over a year. What had once been an isolated tragedy in Portland was now understood as the first known act in a series. One offender. 3 victims. 2 states. On July 17, 1996, John Joubert was executed in the state of Nebraska. For the families of the victims, the execution marked an end to the legal process, but not to the loss. The absence left behind by each child could not be resolved in a courtroom. What remained were memories and the quiet weight of what had been taken. Beyond the families, the case left a broader impact. It exposed the limits of communication between jurisdictions at the time. A murder in Maine had not been connected to crimes in Nebraska until the offender himself revealed the link. It highlighted the importance of forensic detail. A single bite mark had prevented a wrongful conviction, even as the real killer remained free. And perhaps most unsettling, it revealed how easily violence could exist behind an ordinary exterior. John Joubert was not hidden in isolation. He lived among others, worked within structured systems, followed routines. And yet, within that normalcy, he carried something else entirely. Something that only became visible after it had already taken lives. The case closed with certainty. It raised important questions. How can we better detect potential problems? How can we prevent them from happening? And how well do we really know the people in our lives? Created a story that was heartbreaking and mysterious. Today's story will show how carelessness can lead to dire consequences when an investigation begins. Typically, the circumstances tend to complicate the investigation. Unfortunately, some detectives manipulate these circumstances to fit their narrative. This can result in a controversial case like the one we will discuss today, which still many unanswered questions. Marta Russo, born in 1975, described as intelligent, energetic, and promising. At the time of the events, Marta had just turned 22 in March. She was a young and beautiful law student at the prestigious University of La Sapienza in Rome. Fulfilling her long-held dream of attending this historic institution, Marta had ambitious plans for her future and aspired to become a lawyer. Before achieving that goal, she needed to complete her degree. She was known for being compassionate and sociable, always eager to help others. She even expressed her wish to donate her organs in the event of her death. On the morning of May 9, 1997, she was having a typical day, walking on the university campus with her friend Rosanna Capone, moving between the buildings of the University of Statistics, Politics, and Law. They were carrying textbooks and notebooks while discussing their upcoming exams. There were no signs of anything unusual happening. Suddenly, at 11:42, Rosanna heard a strange clicking sound, and Marta collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Rosanna thought it might have been a weapon, but she wasn't certain. Several witnesses who saw Marta fall rushed over to help. However, other passers-by disagreed with Rosanna's belief that Marta had been attacked by force. They listened to Rosanna but thought she was mistaken, as the possibility of a violent attack at such a time and place seemed too improbable. All doubts were quickly resolved when a pool of blood began to form beneath the head of Marta. Who would attack a defenseless student in the middle of the day on a university campus filled with people? It seemed unbelievable. Marta had been wounded, and a small bullet hole was discovered in her left ear, indicating that the bullet had entered her brain. Bystanders called for an ambulance right away, which arrived to assess her condition. Marta was alive but in critical condition and needed to be rushed to the hospital. Once at the clinic, she fell into a coma. Her brain function ceased, but life support was maintained in hopes that she might recover. Her parents prayed for her safety and hoped she would regain consciousness. Meanwhile, doctors recognized that her chances of recovery were nearly non-existent. Even if Marta did wake up, there was almost a certainty that she would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. At the time, forensic experts were working at the crime scene. It was an open area connecting two university buildings. Along the edges of the passage, there was a building facade with windows and a blank wall opposite, with a few sparse trees. Detectives needed to determine the attacker's location at the time of the incident. Marta's friend couldn't pinpoint where the sound came from. It was very quiet, and Rosanna was the only witness to hear the sound of the attack. Another challenge arose when Marta's body was moved several times during attempts to help her. This made it difficult for detectives to establish her exact position when she was attacked, to find the location of the criminal. In order to understand who could even have the idea to shoot an ordinary student, the police began investigating Marta's background. Investigators believed that she may have been in contact with a villain or even involved in a crime, but the investigation showed that the victim was an ordinary, kind girl, and studying her biography did not turn up any potential suspects. Her friends were also typical students, and she had not been in a relationship recently, she spending all her free time studying. Even her diary entries were examined, but they contained nothing suspicious. The investigators began to suspect that the killer's true target was Rosanna. Marta just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, so was killed by accident. The police had gathered some remarkable information. In the days leading up to the murder, Rosanna received 45 anonymous phone calls, which were quite unusual. When she answered one call, there was only silence on the other end, and she gained no information. Additionally, an unknown man called Rosanna's father late at night caused a heated debate where he insulted her but never revealed his identity. With this information, the police started to believe that the attacker intended to kill Rosanna, but mistakenly killed Marta instead. They considered the possibility that the attack was a failed act of revenge against Rosanna's father. He is an influential official who oversaw several prisons. The investigators was thought that the murder of his daughter could be the work of a former inmate. However, detectives investigated these theories and ultimately found them unconvincing. While Rosanna's father may have had enemies, there was no evidence to suggest a motive for harming his family members. Another hypothesis is put forward. The university, in addition to its fame, always had a bad reputation. There have been multiple uprisings and spontaneous attacks on campus. Such cases do happen with alarming frequency. This university was even the site of a terrorist attack on February 12, 1980. Unknown assailants riot in the lobby by weapon in one of the academic buildings while a professor was present. He was attacked 7 times and died as a result. This attack was not an isolated incident. It occurred during a time of heightened political tension, with similar outbreaks linked to the so-called Red Brigades. On March 27, 1985, a university economics professor became a victim of unknown criminals in a new attack. The Red Brigades claimed responsibility for these crimes, stating that such actions were part of their political struggle. However, the murder of Marta, and even Rosanna in 1997, appeared to be senseless acts of violence in this context. Another supporting detail for this theory is the coincidence that May 9th marked the anniversary of the discovery of the body of Aldo Moro, a prominent political figure. It is believed that on this occasion, the Red Brigades decided to launch a new artillery attack. In previous incidents, the Red Brigades had openly admitted their guilt for the crimes they committed. Yet this time, no one took responsibility for the attack on Marta Russo. This was illogical, as it would have made more political sense to target a university professor rather than an ordinary student. As the police investigated, doctors were tried to save Marta. A surgeon removed a .22 caliber bullet from her head, which was then sent to the lab for analysis. At this point, ballistics experts believed that the faint noise heard was likely due to either the use of a silencer or the types of weapons that produce a quieter sound, especially at a distance, making it hard to identify. The .22 caliber was a common choice, as it has low stopping power and generates significantly less noise than more weapon firearms. Forensic experts worked on reconstructing the bullet's trajectory to help identify potential shooting locations. However, because the body had been moved, their efforts were ultimately insufficient and likely inaccurate. The investigation indicated that the attacker likely operated from a building across the street from where the victim was walking. It was presumed that the guy has attacked from a window. Calculations suggested that the guy was in a bathroom adjacent to the classrooms where statistics students were studying. Given the low number of students present at that time, this location allowed the attacker to remain unnoticed and escape without drawing attention. The day after the attack, this theory was supported by a statement from a statistics student who reported visiting the bathroom shortly after the incident. He noticed that the window was wide open, even though it was usually kept closed. Detectives focused their efforts on the area, including the street beneath the window. They quickly located the shell casing from the weapon, which had been overlooked on the first day because it was hidden under a car. To the surprise of ballistic experts, the casing did not match the bullet that killed Marta. Investigators found numerous bullet holes on the wall next to the crime scene. It appears that the students used the restroom as a weapons practice range. Someone had been practicing frequently. A cartridge case discovered at the scene might have come from these practice sessions. While investigating the bathroom, police also uncovered a small nearby room used as a storage area by a cleaning company that worked at the university. Given the trajectory of the bullet, detectives considered this room as a possible location from which the criminal attacked. Access to this room was initially restricted. Investigators conducted thorough checks on all cleaning company employees associated with the university. They discovered that many of these employees were weapon enthusiasts with licenses. Some of them could obtain weapons even without a license. Furthermore, the inventory storage room contained a significant amount of ammunition. Investigators found various types of weapons and equipment, including silencers. They also discovered several different types of bullets, including .22 caliber cartridges. It is curious that the employees of the cleaning company were free from cleaning from 9 to 14 o'clock, and there should not have been anyone there. The attack on Marta occurred at 11:42 a.m., which fell within this time frame. Investigators needed to interview all the cleaners, but they offer alibis in an effort to clear themselves of suspicion. Eventually, all the employees' information was verified. During the investigation, no illegal firearm storage was discovered, as the owners had proper licenses were registered. The cleaning staff admitted that they occasionally used the wall of a nearby building as a weapons practice range, but they insist on always practicing from a trailer and being cautious when no one is around. This situation raised more questions. On May 14, the equipment keeping Marta alive was turned off, and she was pronounced dead. She had been in a coma for 5 days without recovering. Her parents and sister honored her last wish by donating her organs. Around 10,000 people attended Marta's funeral, including relatives, friends, students, and local residents who wanted to pay their respects to her. The mother of Marta revealed that she felt a strong sense of anxiety on the morning of the tragedy, which she found impossible to shake off. Initially, she didn't think much of her unease until the police contacted her about Marta's problem. There was growing public dissatisfaction with the police due to a series of high-profile cases that had not been solved. These failures severely harmed the reputation of the police in Rome. Therefore, they was urgently necessary to restore the lost reputation. This provoked decisive actions from the police, which had a devastating effect. The investigation began when detectives approached the librarian, a 36-year-old man who owns a suppressor and a .22 caliber weapon. Initially, he was considered a suspect, but he had a solid alibi. He was in the audience during the attack, and many witnesses confirmed his presence. As a result, he was cleared of suspicion. The detectives enlisted top forensic experts to search for microscopic gunpowder particles in the building. They meticulously examined windowsills, floors, and various surfaces to identify the location from which of the attacker. Unfortunately, significant time had elapsed since the incident, and the room had been cleaned multiple times. Additionally, rain the following day may have washed away any evidence on the building's exterior. Investigators scoured several floors, and after about 3 hours, they discovered 2 tiny particles of barium and antimony, which are linked to weapon. However, not on the windowsills in the restroom, but on the floor above, in office number 6, rather than on the restroom windowsills. In office number 6, a stain on the windowsill was suspected to be gunpowder, but it was uncertain because many employees in the building owned weapon. Therefore, it was challenging to determine who might have left the trace. Despite the doubt, the stain was deemed reliable evidence. The substance's chemical composition was analyzed, revealing similarities to printer ink or burnt rubber. Investigators concentrated on office number 6, which was a likely location for the attack. Based on the possible trajectory calculations, the attack could have originated from almost anywhere on the campus facade, including the roof. Nevertheless, the police identified the individuals who were in that room during the time of the attack. The office was designated for department assistants, and both students and faculty could access it. All individuals present were questioned. During the investigation, detectives noticed a peculiar pattern. Each person claimed they were not in room number 6 at the time of the murder. The investigators suspected this was a sign of collusion among them. While searching office number 6, they discovered a mobile phone that had made a call at 11:44 on the day of the case, just minutes after the attack. The investigators traced the call to a professor's daughter named Maria Chiara Lipari. She admitted to being in the room during the call, but claimed she did not see anyone with a weapon. She firmly denied any involvement in the murder, stating she did not know Marta, had no motive, and did not possess a weapon of the specified caliber. At this point, the police officers were determined to investigate the situation involving office number 6 thoroughly. They decided to interview Maria at the police station. During these interviews, Maria appeared confused and changed her story multiple times. She was questioned 13 times, and she provided new details in almost every session. Afterward, she expressed that the investigators were pressuring her. Eventually, she recalled that when she returned to office number 6 to make a phone call, a man had come out to meet her. He mumbled something unclear, like hello, but Maria did not recognize him and only watched as he walked away. However, her account changed once again. Maria had a confirmed alibi, which ultimately protected her from being accused. She attributed her behavior to fear and severe stress, and ultimately, she was crossed off the list of suspects. Unfortunately, Maria's troubles were just beginning. One of the suspects was a man named Salvatore Ferraro, who out to be an assistant in philosophy and law. Maria identified him, and he quickly began cooperating with the police. She felt compelled to do this under the threat of being charged. According to her, he resembled the young man who had exited office number 6 when she entered, but she remained uncertain until the very end. The story underwent frequent changes, likely due to the ongoing pressure on Maria. The first interrogation lasted 14 hours, after which investigators repeatedly approached her, increasing the pressure. It is unclear if Maria can be considered a reliable source. but the detectives were determined to find the killer at any cost. To verify her statements, they conducted numerous interrogations with other individuals connected to office number 6. These witnesses provided inconsistent testimonies that did not align with one another. In light of this, the investigators worked hard to piece the information together. At one point, Bruno Romano, the university director, intervened. She expressed her dissatisfaction with the police's handling of the case and pointed out several violations she had observed. Her main concern was that the investigation was not allowing lawyers to be present during witness interviews. Because of her complaints, the director herself became a suspect, now under investigation for allegedly covering up for the killer to protect the university from problems. Under public pressure, the police sought to find a suspect, but all the individuals they considered had solid alibis. The focus then shifted to Gabriella Aledo, the secretary of the university head. Maria reported that Gabriella had been in office number 6 before the attack. The police began to put serious pressure on Gabriella, even threatening her. In parallel, they established wiretapping of the phone in the office where she worked, and there were even plans to install a hidden camera. During her conversations with investigators, Gabriella faced explicit threats. They warned her that if she didn't identify the murderer, she would be accused of the crime herself. On the 45th anniversary of the incident, Gabriella, wanting to protect her career and personal life, stated that she was far from office number 6 and had no knowledge of who might be responsible for the murder. She emphasized that an illness she had endured for years prevented her use of weapons. The detectives were so eager to resolve the case that they even brought in doctors to verify her medical condition. They interrogated Gabriella relentlessly, including her son-in-law, who worked in law enforcement, to pressure her into confessing. Despite being a relative, he played a role in forcing her to confess. The other detectives departed, leaving Gabriella alone with her son-in-law. Despite the circumstances, he was unable to extract a confession from her. The only thing she admitted was that she had been in office number 6. The absence of lawyers added to the complications of the situation, driving Gabriella into despair. Besides, on June 11, authorities decided to arrest director Bruno Romano, charging him with aiding and abetting the murderer, as it was suspected he was covering up for the crime. Later, when criminal cases were brought against all participants in the investigation for abuse of office, the prosecutor insisted that this was a trick to scare those involved. Gabriella, feeling the weight of the intimidation, especially following the arrest of the director, lost her composure out of fear. Eventually, she revealed that on the day of the murder, she saw 2 men in office number 6. One of them drew a weapon when Marta Russo and her friend were positioned between the window and the opposite wall. He attacked, causing Marta to fall. Gabriella also recalled that the young men appeared panicked and clearly did not expect to kill anyone, as they ran away in fear. Witnesses identified the gunman as Salvatore Ferraro. The second man was recognized as Giovanni Scattoni, a 29-year-old philosophy assistant. After receiving the confessions, the detectives were able to piece together all the information. Initially, the young men did not appear to be the type to commit a cold-blooded murder. Even unintentionally, the investigators were not troubled by the fact that Salvatore and Giovanni were not acquainted with Marta and had no motive. They repeatedly denied their guilt, but the Gabriella's confession making it difficult to deny. A major issue for Salvatore arose from the searches conducted in his apartment, where forensic books about the ideal crime were discovered. Investigators quickly assumed that this suggested he had plans for a perfect murder. Although Salvatore argued that he needed this material for his university research, the investigators pointed out that forensic science is not typically a focus for philosophers. However, there was a significant problem. The detectives have been unable to find the weapon that killed Marta. During the trial, both Salvatore and Giovanni maintained their calm demeanor and continued to assert their innocence. There was no direct evidence linking them to the crime, yet the prosecution labeled them as ruthless murderers. Although the prosecution presented evidence from Gabriella, but the jury was out on this. They focused on the traces of gunpowder found on the windowsill of office number 6 and the bullet's trajectory, overlooking the fact that this information was largely inaccurate and speculative. Witnesses who had endured long periods of torture testified. The trial photos clearly showed that Gabriella and Maria struggled to conceal their fear. This situation echoed the experience of a security guard who had seen the defendants in office number 6. He had been a suspect in the case, but chose to cooperate with the police and was later cleared of any suspicion. During the trial, Gabriella recounted how the defendants fled the university after the attack, but this did not prove their involvement in the case. The defense lawyers for the students pointed out that the particles found on the windowsill were not from weapon, but rather from car exhaust. This suggested that the attack could have originated from a different window, potentially implicating other individuals. The lawyer argued that the witness testimonies were exaggerated. Experts, based on their reconstruction of the events, believed that Marta's death resulted from a tragic accident during a reckless game. The attack occurred accidentally due to a series of ricochets hitting her head, which would classify it as manslaughter. By the end of the trial in 2001, both defendants were found guilty. Giovanni received a reduced sentence of 5 years for manslaughter and unlawful possession of firearms, initially sentenced to 7 years. Salvatore involved in the torture of women, but had all charges dropped by university officials. After their convictions, they appealed their sentences, prompting a review. The Supreme Court upheld Giovanni's manslaughter sentence, but dismissed the illegal possession charge. Consequently, Giovanni's prison time was shortened to 5 years, and he was ordered to pay 300,000 euros in legal fees. This case raises many questions, as there is still uncertainty about the guilt of Giovanni and Salvatore, making it a highly controversial situation. However, some supporters feel that justice has been served. The victims of the police officers' actions spoke out, expressing their dissatisfaction, leading to significant public outcry in internal investigations. Their accounts were corroborated by strong evidence, which included several interrogation recordings that contained threats. These victims have expressed their concerns to investigators. Gabriella reported feeling intimidated and unsafe, and she highlighted the lack of legal representation during interrogations. This action was risky, as it was believed that the police might have support. So, their appeal led to a new investigation. Unfortunately, it quickly ended with no police officers facing any consequences. Gabriella and Maria have long been free and are continuing their lives. Gabriella, now over 50, is a philosophy teacher in Rome who has had to decline several opportunities and faces criticism. Salvatore Ferraro works as a lawyer. He writes books, appears in shows, and helps those who have suffered from injustice and cruelty. The most troubling aspect is that if there was indeed a miscarriage of justice, Marta's killer is still at large. To help alleviate some of the pain caused by this situation, an exception was made for Marta's family. Marta's mother was permitted to embrace the woman who has survived for 20 years thanks to Marta's heart. She is grateful for this gift, recognizing that through this generous act, a part of Marta lives on in others.